you can hear us, please make sure to let us know. Hello. I feel like, I don't know why, but I feel like my camera is zoomed in weirdly, and I don't know why it's doing that, if it's doing that. Maybe I'm just crazy, but I feel so much closer to the screen than I normally am.
And as we await people to tell us whether you can hear us or not, I will drop a quick. Yes, I am wearing my wife's headphones because she took over my computer last night when she was streaming for Inside the Rookery. And it means, unfortunately, she has run away with my headphones, leaving me with this beautiful headset, which is just lovely.
I think they're the most fitting headphones you could wear for Sigmar. I don't know why, but they just are.
Yeah, they rock. Yeah, I really quite like them. So maybe they should become a thing, eh? Like my N7 hats or some equivalent. But yes, today is going to be a fun one. It's one I'm enormously looking forward to because this is one of my favorite subjects, as I will get onto when I go into what is inevitably going to be a long, sprawling introduction to everything that is Sigmar. This is potentially epic.
But potentially, yeah, I think it will be.
Yeah.
But yeah, good. Looks like everyone can hear and see us. So
excellent.
We're looking great on all that.
Marvelous. Okay, so before we get started, our normal caveats. Although I'm going to add a slight touch of extra pepper to the caveat today. So caveat number one, as is always the case, we're going to have super chats popping up and we're going to be interrupting the general stories of Sigmar that we're going to be telling with answering various questions. But today I'm actually really keen to receive these because we cannot cover all of Sigmar today. It's impossible. Sigmar, much like the story of Warhammer, is a big branching, sometimes contradictory tale, and often contradictory tale. And that means that we have too much information to cover. Now, in the past, when we've had characters or situations in the Warhammer world where that's the case, we tended to just skim. Or, in the case of the end times, just randomly spout about all the stuff we didn't like. Today, we're going to be a little bit more structured. And we have a plan for what we intend to loosely cover today, but we may not even reach that because there's so much of it to do. So this is very, very much part one. And we plan further parts for this. I imagine Sigmar might not even be covered in 3 parts, given just how much potential information there is. However, I think if we do it well, 2 parts to 3 parts is most likely. As to when we do the other parts, that'll be a mixture of when we want to, depending on how today goes down. We might really enjoy today. We might go, hey, let's do another one in a couple of months. And maybe on our next birthday, because Sigmar is such an important subject, not just for Warhammer, but to us as well, particularly me, because I have written a ton of material about Sigmar down through the years. So this is very much going to be a topic of multiple parts, but to try and ensure that we don't get a similar situation as we did with the end times, where we kind of just meandered, we're going for a bit more structure today.
Yeah, and today is mostly, I'm sure we'll meander a little bit outside of this, but it's mostly going to be aimed at Sigmar the man, like Sigmar Unburigan, as opposed to Sigmar the god, which is a similar subject, but at the same time, a very, very different subject that has its own bottomless pits of things to discuss.
It absolutely does. And it's also worth noting that because we're aware that quite a lot of you might not actually be aware of where Sigmar came from in the first place, we'll start off with a history, not just of the man and the god, but of the character. Where it came from, exactly how it came about, and what it became over time, because the character significantly changed, and obviously its impact in Games Workshop significantly changed. And then we will dive deep into the actual man part of the man god. I'm really looking forward to it. Now, the reason why I brought up our super chat bits is because we're not going to cover everything through the course of this stream. It is impossible. You might have questions that you're particularly keen to see answered. If they come up, post them today. Today's the day for it. If you've got any questions about Sigmar, bring them in and ask, because now's the time to do it. We know that we're not going to return to this subject for at least a while. So if there is anything out there, whether you're playing a role-playing game and you've got a character of Sigmar and you want to know more about it, or alternatively, if you're playing just the Empire and you don't understand why the character is being used the way that it is, get your questions in. We will answer them. If we have a lot of super chats today, we will try to move through them swiftly. swiftly, but we will be in depth as we can be. I'm really keen on this one because I've done a lot of work on Sigmar.
Yep. Speaking of which, why don't we go ahead and smack the ones real quick that came in?
Sounds like a perfect start. Let me see if I can. Whoop! Started the wrong one there.
Laughing God, hello. Good day, Lorebeards. I just wanted to share out a wild month last month. Got a house, and my girlfriend became my fiance on Halloween. Only a few weeks before that, we found out she's pregnant. Holy Lord, that is a trio.
Congratulations! Absolutely stupendous news. I'm delighted for you, Laughing God. It is a very good part of anyone's life. I remember going through that part, but also great times are ahead for you. Do not listen to anyone who says that marriage isn't the best thing in the world. It freaking is.
Yep, that's very, very wonderful to hear for you, my dude. I hope everything goes very smoothly, very wonderfully, and y'all make sure to take care of each other.
Okay, didn't say marriage. Oh, no, fiancé did say marriage. Phew, I thought I'd overstepped there for a moment. I was like...
Sean Schultz, is Sigmar basically Games Workshop's Conan the Barbarian?
No, because Conan did not become a god in the same way that Sigmar does. However, I will very much be referencing that when I go into my intro.
Yep, we'll be discussing that.
Definitely.
Riley, just got back from my honeymoon and was a little sad to miss the End Times 2.0, but here I am. Well, the good news is the VOD is still there, and, unfortunately, you can't have VODs on honeymoons. So, well, I guess you...
I mean, you can, but, you know... I'm going to say that your honeymoon should possibly be used for other things.
Maraz, I knew Sigmar. He was a total wanker.
I think this is something that is interesting for Warhammer history as a whole, and I do think, Marathi, you bring up a good point, and that's that for all we're going to be discussing today, a character that is enshrouded in myth and legend, quite literally from the legendary series of books, myth and legend. It's also a character that's within living memory of many of the entities that live within the Warhammer world. So, as much as that's an interesting point, I don't think we'll be debating it or discussing it too much, primarily because we are dealing with a character that's mostly myth. But some people, like Marathi, were already ancient by the time Sigmar was born.
Very true. Maraz just finished Guy Haley's Scarstick novel.
Oh, nice.
One of the best I've ever read. It's a really fun one. Chapter written from a captured dwarf's perspective is a wonderful and sad piece of writing. Yeah, that is a excellent book that's written in a really clever series of ways, and the ones where you get the dwarf perspectives that show the greenskins from that side. Yeah, it's a bummer. it's a big bummer.
Cut a long story short, Guy Haley's great. Yes, I met him when I was last down in when I was last at Bugman's, actually. We had a big long chat, and he's just the best. That's it.
Singemeister, yes, Sigmar Heldenhammer, or to give him his full name, Sigmar Skibbity Ohio Riz Gyat Mew Gritty Preppy Heldenhammer. God, some of that was English.
I'm pretty sure I didn't write that.
Just wait until they get that Generation Zoomer author, and he'll whoever that is will rectify that.
Just as a small aside on that one, it's interesting how language evolves. And I bring this up purely to say that when I was writing on the second edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, there was an unexpected editorial decision as to what words could and couldn't be used. Words, for example, like okay, which are very much a relatively modern contrivance, should never be used. And that is really quite interesting, given that it was in several places. So you'll find that in 20, 30, 40 years' time, your ridiculous comment might actually be the language that is being deployed within official books. Because
God, I hope not.
Language changes.
Yeah. Roger Hamilton, hope you have a great time with the Patriot God of the Empire. Nobility and ethnic cleansing. Oh, Sigmar has many problematic elements in his background, much like the Emperor of Man in Warhammer 40k has an enormous number of problematic elements. So, yeah, everyone's favorite god of the Empire's nobility and ethnic cleansing. Yeah, which is a very important aspect of him that we'll get into. Let's start, Chris. Does the name Sigmar mean anything specific in Warhammer itself?
No. It was a name chosen purely because it sounded cool and it fit the background that they were making.
There you go.
That doesn't mean that it isn't given additional significance by later writers. but originally, no.
Yeah, so I guess just to follow up for that for listener Chris, I guess he would be asking like how in our world it's like, oh, if your name is such and such, it actually means this. Do you think there's anywhere in the Empire where that has become a thing?
So if you look at ancient Umberrigan, as in the language that was spoken by Sigmar and the Umberrigan tribe, yes. And if you want to get real world equivalent, Sigmar is a real world name. You can go check it up, what it means, and it'll be broadly speaking the same. But in terms of the potential additional significance that could come from the fictional languages, there was no significance chosen when the name was chosen. So it wasn't chosen for a specific reason due to its meaning, but that doesn't mean that we couldn't, as writers at a later date, say, aha, it actually means this. But that was not the case at its inception.
Yep. Baranak, do the souls oh boy, do the souls of Sigmarites get consumed by Sigmar or consumed by Sigmar or more after death? I just read the Liber Necris and I now have more questions than answers. What a book.
Yeah, so Liber Necris, Liber Necris is great for basically throwing a big oar right into the middle of the workings of the potential cosmology of Warhammer. Now, sadly, the answer to your question is uncertain because the nature of what happens with souls after death has never been properly pinned down, really anywhere. There have been lots of contradictory sources suggesting, oh, this happens, oh, that happens. And sometimes they've even relatively blanketly gone, no, all souls go to Mar. And then another book says something quite different. Another book says all of the gods have got their own special realm that you go to in the afterlife. So the answer to this is people don't know, and that's where faith comes in. And it's a core component of the Warhammer world because the Warhammer world is a world where the gods are real. And that immediately makes you go, well, you don't need to have faith in them. You don't need to have any doubt that they exist. And it's not their existence you doubt. It's what happens that you doubt. What happens after death is uncertain. It's why books like the Liber Necris exist, as they attempt to collate and very much ascertain what happens after death. And this is from the perspective of a vampire who has a very, let's say, biased view. If you went to the Cult of Mor says that the great holy ravens of Mor ferries everybody over to the portal, and then you go through the portal where Mor awaits for you on the other side, and then those who are special to one of the gods get ferried over to that particular afterlife, and other ones just go into the great limbo that is the afterlife of Mor. But there are other cults that say other things. So the answer here is it is uncertain, and that's probably for the benefit of the setting because it then provides an option for people to have faith in their version of what they think happens in the afterlife.
Yeah, and the Liber Necris is, in my opinion, one of the best ways to do it because it's, once again, me and Andy have talked about this a lot. It's an in-character, in-universe explanation of things where you have Manfred, like Andy said, a vampire, who's translating Nehekaran writings for the benefit of the reader while also inserting his own opinions, which makes it a super-duper fun book while also introducing things that could be true, but also require some grains of salt.
Indeed. In fact, I will say that some of the best writings on Sigmar also follow this model. But we'll be getting onto that as we discuss that a little later.
Yep. CEO of Necromancy. Oh yeah, time for the great, definitely not Ulrich and Demon Prince Barbarian.
Yeah, I think this is a great point because there was particularly during the late first edition into second edition fantasy roleplay era. So we're talking Warhammer 5th edition through to Warhammer 7th edition. This idea of ascension and what it meant and how it doesn't make any sense. How could any humans do this? And then the dawning realization that went through that era of, wait a minute, demon princes do it all the time. Like, all the time. Wait a minute, does that mean, and effectively the point that you're making here is that a mortal has ascended and become immortal on the other side, in the realm of the gods, let's say. That's exactly what happens with demon princes when they are chosen by one of the great chaos powers, or indeed any of the chaos powers. And exactly what happens with Sigmar. We'll go on to that, but to cut a long story short, he does ascend from being a mortal to godhood, and he is, supposedly, crowned by Ulrich. Meaning that if you wish to spin it this way, you have a very strong argument for doing so.
Yep. Abarash. bit like Andy, am an Elgin. What? That's different for me.
I'm not an Elgin loon myself. I come from all over Scotland, but I was born in Dundee.
There you go. He can understand what that means. Hagen, hail to the true man emperor of mankind. Love catching you guys.
Yeah, this is an interesting one because many writers have attempted to make strong connections between Sigmar and the Emperor. Now, I don't mean actual connections, as in 40k Emperor is linked through to Sigmar, not at all. But using Sigmar and the Emperors, for example, in a similar way to how the Emperor has been used in 40k. And the cults that work around the Emperor, the cults that work around Sigmar. And that's both to the advantage and detriment of how some of the writers have approached the writing for Sigmar, because it's changed the nature of how that character has been presented, depending upon which writer has picked up the reins on one particular year. So, yes, I think that, again, as much as this is a comment that is almost tongue-in-cheek, I think there's some accuracy in it. And that some writers have very much gone, 40k is successful because of this, 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 and this. I want to take some of that success and bring it into my writing. Or indeed have been even told, hey, this is over here. We would like a Warhammer equivalent. Not the same. We want Warhammer and 40k to be very discreet, but we want something similar there that we can draw upon. And it's fair to say that come the end, that's what it becomes. Look at the Sigmarines of Age of Sigmar.
Yeah, oh, yeah. Yeah, he full-on evolves into...
Yeah.
Well, that's a discussion for another time.
That's a discussion. But it's most certainly worth, because it is part of Sigmar's entire tale, it's worth definitely recognizing, even though it is a conversation we will almost certainly be having later.
Yep. Patrick Mulligan asks, is there any news on the Ship of Fools release date?
Yeah, we've completely changed what we were originally going to do. The thing's finished. We were just discussing what we're going to be doing with the parts what day is it on now? It was last Wednesday. But we have an entire roleplay game that's now coming along with it. So watch this space. I'm literally beavering away like mad on parts of it right now. But we have decided to broaden our release quite significantly.
Awesome. From somewhere, first time catching live. You guys are incredible to
Hey.
listen to. Make my day with every single episode. Excited to hear your thoughts on the big slab of buff man himself. Buff man.
Slab and buff man. Yeah, totally.
Yep. Well, thank you for joining us. We're really happy to have you here.
Delighted. Thank you.
1300. Sigmar is my favorite god of all of the Warhammers. I've been waiting for this since the Malarian / Malgith episode. Can't wait for the interpretations of Big S. Oh, yeah.
So I'm, contrary to many people's expectations, going to mirror this. Sigmar is one of my favorite gods. I don't necessarily like everything that's been done with Sigmar. In particular, somewhat controversially, I really hate that he became a core component of Age of Sigmar, because we didn't need another big white bearded man to be the core component of an entire setting. It's not needed. They could have done almost anything. And what did they do? Big guy! Oh, seriously. Nevertheless, one of my favorite gods in general. But that's because I've not just written a lot about it. I've researched a lot, played a lot, used it so much over time that it can't help but be one of the favorite things that sits in the back of my mind.
Yeah, Sigmar, you'll gather this as y'all are listening to this particular stream, but Sigmar is one of those gods that you can't kind of help but fall in love with him the more you learn about him, because he's got such a good mix of, you feel like you can see that realistic human that's there somewhere behind all of the stories and stuff, but it's so heavily obfuscated. Even though there are those tantalizing bits of, like, there are people around vaguely still that, like, knew him in some various ways. And it's like, you feel like there should be easy answers but there never are, which in and of itself opens a lot of really fun mysteries.
It does.
Which is great. BioFoot78, what is a bigger heel face turn? Andy becoming a Neko anime character or Sigmar becoming a fishman?
Oh.
Would Fishman Sigmar have a twin tail?
He absolutely would.
Of course he would.
Damn straight.
Who's to say he doesn't? We've never seen him naked, you know?
Neko anime. Wow, I'd make a great Neko anime character.
You would. Avarash, Time of Legends books, do you recommend? No, you dislike the Nagash books. Gave up when it reduced Vashanesh to a do-nothing flunky called Uncut. So, Time of Legends, most of them are quite good. Like the Sigmar series, super fun.
Yeah, super fun.
We're going to talk about quite a bit. The Sundering with Gav Thorpe is really fun.
Yeah.
Honestly, pretty much any of them except Nagash were great.
Yeah, I broadly agree. The Time of Legends books as a whole, I'm going to get into this a little bit as we move on to discussing Sigmar's Time of Legends books. But the Time of Legends books as a whole were a great idea, but they sort of lacked an overall single unity of vision as to what exactly they were there to do. So I think they could have done with an overall, I'm the editor and this is what the entirety of the series is here to do, and we're aiming towards an end goal. We're telling a story, but it didn't do that. And sadly, it gives you a bit of a mixed bag. But go dive into the Sigmar books. Graham McNeil did a great job there.
Yeah, I will say, I think the best ones, like as far as they took all of the lore that I'm aware of that existed for those, and they added to it in really, really great ways, were the Black Plague trilogy and the War of Vengeance trilogy.
War of Vengeance.
Those two are, what did I say?
I was agreeing.
Yeah. War of Vengeance, War of the Beard. Yeah. Those two are super good, and they toss in ideas that whether or not like Games Workshop would keep them 100% canon is of course super debatable if Games Workshop ever focuses on those subjects again. But they introduce ideas that are very, very like, oh my gosh, like you'll have a lot of eyebrow raised moments that are very fun, and feel like they make sense within the wider universe.
Yeah, and what I particularly like about those as well is that they lack relatively heavy contradictions to the established lore, which means that they're not only good, fun reads that are adding loads of cool stuff, they're also reads that don't make you go, oh, why'd they change that? Why'd they change that? Instead, you're going, oh, wow, okay, that's cool. I didn't expect that. So, yeah, really good. Agreed.
Yep. Patrick Mulligan. I cannot believe Sotek accused Nagash of misogyny. He's a genocidal, sadistic, maniacal maniac, which is fine. But misogynist, that's just a step too far.
It's not that it's a step too far. It's that it was out of character. And there's a big difference, a significant difference. The genocidal sadomasochism, megalomaniacal part, not masochism, pardon me, that absolutely was within character and spoke to the type of character he was. The other part, though, was nothing more than a copy-paste from real-world situations rather than thinking about the world in which they were in. And that was why the comment most likely popped up.
Morgan Crescent, which clan of Skaven did Andy skin for those ears? More seriously, Crown of Sorcery Sigmar. We will talk about that.
Oh, the Crown of Sorcery is a big thing.
All right.
Alrighty, so time. Should I jump into some form of intro? Right. Sigmar. As you know, I like to have a little bit of a history dive sometimes when we're doing our Lorebeards episodes, where we go back and have a little look at where characters come from inside the lore. And in this instance, I don't just kind of feel like it's useful. I really want to. And there's a reason I want to. I've done this myself for my own work. I've written a lot about Sigmar. At one point, I was tasked with collecting everything ever written about Sigmar so that I could put it all together for Games Workshop and turn it into a single cohesive whole for one of their books. And that meant that I read everything again and again, because I'm that kind of guy. I like to ensure that everything that I'm putting down on paper either doesn't contradict or contradicts for a reason, because it's in time, much as good old Sotek was suggesting earlier. If it's in time and it's an individual faith or belief, it makes sense. That works for that individual, but that's not saying that the God voice says it's this. So this is a subject that's very close to me, but it's also, I would argue, a subject that's very close to Games Workshop as a whole. The story of Sigmar, as I vaguely intimated earlier on, is very much the story of Warhammer nowadays. It was never going to be that. And as we'll discuss as I go through where Sigmar came from, you'll see it really was never going to be that. But because of a selection of choices Games Workshop almost funneled themselves towards what would eventually become Age of Sigmar. How they moved Warhammer to Age of Sigmar, I think, is fascinating. And it also speaks to why we have different versions of Sigmar out there and why we have some relatively heavy contradictory sources in terms of what Sigmar is, what Sigmarism is, and how we should consider it in terms of the overall game. Now, we do intend this to be multiple parts. So let's be very clear about that. We're not covering everything today. I know I said that at the beginning, but I'm going to re-stress it. The goal of today is for you to understand where Sigmar came from, and then for us to dive into his mortal life and see how far we get. And if we stop at any point, when we return to the stream, we will pick up from where we stopped last time. That's the goal. That's our intent. Let's see how well we do. Alrighty. The beginnings of Sigmar. Where did it all begin? All the way back in 1986. This is a long time ago. I mean, a really long time ago. Sigmar Heldenhammer, as he was first pitched, was introduced to the setting as a whole with more than just a brief Sigmar's a thing. This was Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay First Edition. Now, this is why I'm about to say that Sigmar, in many respects, speaks to Warhammer as a whole. Because Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay was a really special book. What it did was it took the battle game, which had gone through a couple of editions by this point, and it said, what would make a cohesive world for all of this to work with inside? How can we get our medieval Norse troops that are real face off against my Melnibonians from Michael Moorcock, which Citadel Miniature makes? How can I get them to face off against my Spanish miniatures and my Italian miniatures? And they made the Warhammer world. The Warhammer world was a simplified version, in many respects, to begin with, of the old world in the real world, as in Europe. And they slapped a bunch of fantasy races on, and they simplified it all out and said, no, we're not going to worry about all the different peoples and ethnicities of the real world. We're just going to have Spain, Estalia, Italy, Tilia, the Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, Germany, et al. And one person is about to make a choice that completely changes Games Workshop forever. And they don't realize it at this point, because they're just a young writer. They're a young writer working on Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Graham Davis. Graham Davis, who will become synonymous with Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay because he wrote so much in it. My good friend, I love him loads. I've worked with Graham more times than I can care to mention. He was tasked with the Pantheon for the Old World. Now, the Pantheon for the Old World was a discussion in and of itself. Does the Old World have a Pantheon? Or is it like the real world where there's largely one god responsible for most stuff? And Graham, a great lover of the classics, immediately dialed into a more Greco-Roman style of pantheon, which was a complete pantheon of individual deities that were worshipped all over their fantasy version of Europe. And it does not include Sigmar at all. The core pantheon doesn't, because Sigmar, at this point, is not important. Sigmar is relegated right down to, well, minor deity. Not an important god. The important gods at this point are the core gods that we all know and recognize from the real world. The god of death, called Mor, because we're pulling on the old Mort, Mor Latin style name. All of the gods that Graham chose to add were almost classic stereotypes that you would expect to see from a pantheon of gods. And they were all immediately accessible in the same way that most of Warhammer was designed to be. If you've got a thing, you will immediately see it in Warhammer, so you can understand what it is. He rejigged Athena and turned her into Myrmidia, for example. Hades became Mor. All of the core gods that we know got a loose reflection into Warhammer. He built an entire pantheon, bunch of rules were written for them, great. And then we go to the footnotes. Minor deities. Minor deities were a quick way to say there's frickin' loads of deities in Warhammer. Loads of them all over the place. There's gods for rivers. There's gods that are prescribed. There's gods that are good. There's gods that are bad. And they gave 3 examples of minor deities. So these are gods that are considered to be much less important than the core pantheon that had already been presented. They presented just 3 gods there. One was Cain. We all know how important Cain is going to become. Go watch our Cain stream. Oh, yeah. One was Raya, a goddess who would continue to be sort of, well, let's say, not very well tended through the editions until we hit maybe even as late as 4th. And the third was Sigmar Heldenhammer. Now, rarely for Lorebeards, I would like to actually read out the description. And I don't normally do this, but I'd like to do it so that we can see where it all started. This is what Graham wrote. Description. Sigmar was an early king in an area now known as the Empire, who led the alliance of humans and dwarfs, which finally brought the Goblin Wars to an end. Revered as a hero for centuries, within the Empire he is worshipped as the patron deity of the imperial family and of the Empire itself. There is a great temple to him next to the Imperial Palace in Altdorf. The worship of Sigmar is tightly woven in with the politics of the Empire. And its chief priest, the Grand Theogonist, wields great temporal as well as spiritual power. Holy crap, he defined it. This never changes. Everything here has slight tweaks to the language over the course of time. The Goblin Wars slowly but surely just turned into gigantic greenskin horde. Loads of orcs everywhere. But it was the Goblin Wars for a good decade or two afterwards, and even in some modern books is referred to as the Goblin Wars because of just how bad it was for the goblins in the mountain holes of the dwarves. But it just doesn't change. But this is it. That's all there is. If we compare this to the other gods, they have like large screeds, a whole bunch of rules for spells and all the rest of it. Fuck all else for good old Sigmar. It's nice and simple. So, you would think that that would not become the most influential deity that Games Workshop would produce. But of course, you'd be very, very wrong because of the next decision. And I'm going to call out a single book released in 1986 as arguably one of the most influential books that Games Workshop will ever produce, because it defines a part of the old world with such detail that they never escape it. And like a black hole, it just sucks in writers again and again and again. And it's all circulating around one god, Sigmar, which is going to cause a host of issues for writers coming later who've tried to create polytheistic societies, whilst other writers just see the Sigmar bit and that's all they write about. So we start getting our first conflicts. We'll get into that in a moment. So the book is Mistaken Identity, the first part of the Enemy Within campaign. It's a tiny supplement for the new role-playing game that comes out in 1986. And in no way should this tiny supplement have so much weight, but it absolutely does. If you want to go find the PDF for the first edition Mistaken Identity, sometimes bundled up with Shadows over Bergenhafen, you will find a timeline and a description of the cult of Sigmar and, importantly for our stream, Sigmar's life. And all of this is never really changed. The cult structure changes a lot. I'll get into that as we move through. But the core story for Sigmar, with it, the timeline laid in there, is made clear. Now, why did they write about Sigmar? One decision was made. A campaign was needed for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. And they decided they'd set it in the Empire, one of the many places that the core book offered, because the core book was about all of the all of the old world. Estalia was as important as the Empire, as important as Albion, as important as the Border Princes. None of them were more important than any other. So they just made a choice. We're starting in the Empire. Somebody liked that. It was a little bit better. The German names, ha ha ha, that'll be funny. Let's do that one. It'll be great. We can do really bad German puns. We can look up the German football team and just, put their names into our various books because it's pre-internet. They've got no access to other German names. German dictionary from Collins, that's going to have to do for all the various surnames that we're doing. Away we go. They chose the Empire. And because they chose the Empire, Sigmar needed to be detailed because Graham had already written that the primary deity in the Empire was Sigmar Heldenhammer. So he got a big write-up. His entire cult is written up. His story is written up. How he became the first chieftain king of the Umberrigan tribe. How he saved the High King of the Dwarfs, and a great alliance was made, and the Dwarfs gave him, quite literally, the Warhammer of Warhammer. Because if you're starting writing Warhammer, let's start right at the very top. The Warhammer. And then he abdicates after 50 years of rulership, having formed the empire, and is later deified as a god, a local patron deity for the empire. And he's given an entire cult, which is easily seen as some sort of representation of a Catholic Church model ported over and dropped into a polytheistic society. But it isn't. But a lot of, and I do mean a lot, of readers, writers, and gamers viewed it as immediately a Catholic Church analogy, largely because a couple of the pieces of art kind of look like Catholic priests. Which, you know, is a thing. And this would come to dominate a lot of people's thoughts over the course of time, because we don't get a great deal more writing about Sigmar for a good couple of years. And this is important because this is the formative era of Games Workshop's setting. And in this setting, good old Brian Ansell decided that they wanted to have novels, first Games Workshop books. So the people who were writing the novels, none of whom knew, some of them were famous writers at the time as well, and they wrote under pseudonyms, none of them knew the Warhammer world, were given the only background that they had available to them, which was the enemy within. The Empire. Sigmar. Sigmar's great. He's the core component deity. We've spent all of our time here. There's other gods as well. It's polytheistic. They went to town on that. The majority of the first novels are entirely grounded in the Empire. Entirely grounded in this pseudo-fantasy version of Germany during the Holy Roman Empire era. But it's very much a German version, not the whole Holy Roman Empire as it existed in the real world. And it's fascinating. That they take all the details that are presented inside the enemy within, and they turn this into largely, you could almost even see it as a monotheistic society, even in some of the early books. But they always have chaos underneath it all, because chaos was, with the Great Realms of Chaos books getting released at the time, also a core focus. So it tended to be chaos and Sigmar with the occasional mention of other gods. This would set a pattern where Sigmar, slowly but surely, over the course of these early years, becomes the core deity, not just in terms of, hey, Sigmar is the core deity of the Empire, but the core deity of humans in terms of how they're presented again and again and again, because they largely only discuss the Empire. This changes when we hit Warhammer Fantasy Battle 4th edition. It opens its very first paragraph as the land of Sigmar. They don't bother telling you anything about the other gods because they no longer matter. Warhammer Fantasy Battle, which is what pretty much all of Warhammer was built for, including the roleplay game, the whole thing is there to support the miniatures and everything else. Is the battle game came first. A lot of roleplayers like to say, oh, they changed Warhammer Fantasy roleplay because of the battle game. It was made to support the battle game. The whole thing, for all many of the original writers would have preferred it was a far deeper exploration on both sides, it was made to support the battle game. And the Land of Sigmar opens, and this book completely changes everything, but really subtly. Before the Empire Army List came out, the Cult of Sigmar was basically a large and easily seen as Catholic Church analog. It was a very, very, very stratified cult with priests of multiple levels, most of whom gathered power through age, and when they reached their old age, got their most power, and it was temporal and spiritual, but not physical. They were not warriors. None of them were really. Oh, there was ones who wandered around and some of them fought because it's the Warhammer world and it is Warhammer, but the cult of Sigmar was not the cult of the warrior god Sigmar. It was the cult of the patron of the Empire who built the Empire. And this changed significantly with the 4th edition, but it was subtle and it's easy to miss. And it's all because of 3 characters. Sigmar is mentioned again and again and again and again and again. The politics of the Empire is changed in that book, but Sigmar is represented by 3 individuals. Individual number 1, and the one that most people don't realize is a representation of Sigmar, is Karl Franz. The Emperor, who in the Enemy Within campaign previously had been pitched as a doddering old idiot, middle-aged idiot, who was completely broken up. He is turned into a warrior king, riding a griffin, bearing the hammer Ghal Maraz. Now, why is this important? Because The Enemy Within campaign by this point had been finished, and it finished with a book called Empire in Flames. And Empire in Flames told the story of what happened to Sigmar after he abdicates. And it told the story of what happened to his hammer. And this story was not matching up with what the Empire Army List released. Everybody on the roleplay side went up in arms. What are you doing? How could you do this? But it was pre-internet, so the changes to Sigmar didn't really hit the public consciousness, because most of the game players who were playing the fantasy battle game literally didn't care. It was mailing lists of Warhammer Fantasy
They go,
roleplay
oh, I got
groups.
a hammer and a griffin now. Cool.
Yeah, quite exactly. So character number 1 changed the tenor of the Emperor, who was the living embodiment of Sigmar. Because the Emperor is the living embodiment of Sigmar on the throne, because Sigmar made the Empire and gave it down to all of his ancestors, if you believe such things. We'll get into that. The second character was Magnus the Pious. Now, Magnus the Pious is an emperor some 200 years before the time of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and he was the one who ended the Great War Against Chaos that happened about 2300 IC. Basically, it's the big, huge war against Chaos that happened beforehand, and he was the Electra Count who kicked everybody in. And they turned him into a Sigmar worshipping, strength 10 wherever he worship boshing character, which is pretty fucking cool. And they didn't rewrite him, but they certainly made him a warrior version of what he could have been. And the last one was the biggest one, Volkmar. Volkmar the Grim. Now, Volkmar the Grim is Sigmar Pope. Okay, now, if you think of the Pope, do you think of someone who goes to war with a big, mighty warhammer kicking living crap out of everything?
If only.
You don't. But that's what the Grand Theogenist was before that army list. He was an old man who was selected by lots of other old people. Could be an old woman, but in this case, an old man selected by a bunch of other people who was selected because of the temporal and spiritual power they had gathered over time. Not a warrior. Volkmar the Grim also didn't exist in the role-playing game. They just made him up. And that really upset the role players because they had established Grand Theogonists, established Archlectors. They had people it could be, and none of them could kick ass and chew gum as they wielded a giant hammer, boshing things all over the place. The 4th edition army list changed Sigmar from a patron deity of the Empire to a warrior deity. Clearly. Now, there was touches of that in the previous write-ups that had come from the fantasy roleplay game, but it had never really been so blunt. It had never been the cult of Sigmar is about kicking living crap out of shit. There was always the anti-chaos aspect to it, but it absolutely wasn't, in any respect, a warrior god at its core. It was a patron of the Empire, and the army list twisted it. It didn't really say it in black and white, but the manifestations of the character were clear. Sigmar's character, however, would be fundamentally changed forever because of this. We then move to a few, let's be honest, empty years, where lots of novels start filling up the space, and they are given the army list. Sigmar, very first word, Sigmar, and they repeat it again and again and again in the novels. Polytheism becomes less interesting to many of the writers because it's not in the book. And Games Workshop moves away from the roleplay game at this point, which means that they no longer give the roleplay game to their authors. They only give them the army lists, meaning that Sigmar becomes a god of kicking crap out of things, and his priests are almost certainly going to be warriors, aren't they? Because that's what they do. Right, gotcha. And it changes the tenor of how the cult of Sigmar is slowly considered in the background by various authors. It's not that the authors did it wrong, it's that they just had access to different information that they were drawing from when they built it. Now, some of the authors had read the role-playing game, and they added a significant amount of depth. Some of them hadn't. They'd never read it at all. So all they discussed was Sigmar kicking living crap out of things with big hammers because they thought that was cool. Because it is. And through the course of this time, you'd think, well, the roleplay game, is it still going? It is. It's taken over by Hogshead Publishing, run by a chap called James Wallace. Good friend of mine. James is the best. But James, when he was running Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, didn't add to the setting in terms of Sigmar. What he did was he took everything that Games Workshop producing at the time, all the roleplay books from the first edition, and just republished them, and then finished off all the things that they hadn't done. He added a dwarf book, which, by the way, is a great one, Stone and Steel, where he took everything that existed for the dwarves in first edition and then merged it with the army lists. Great book, because it showed how both things could exist at the same time and both work together, which is great. But they didn't really do that with Sigmar. They kind of ignored it. And Sigmar, in the army list side, became more and more the warrior priest god until we hit the year 2000. And it completely changes. Alessio Cavatore actually changes the description of Sigmar and writes, in black and white, inside the warrior priest entry, because it's the first time you can add warrior priests or any sort of priest to your Empire army since all the way back in 3rd edition Warhammer, where it was just random war altars and the like, not necessarily marked out to any individual god. And he said, Sigmar is a warrior god. Black and white. Changes him completely and utterly. All the stories for Sigmar aren't touched. All the thing that Graham originally initiated with the Great War, Blackfire Pass, Goblin Wars coming to an end, none of this has changed. But the manifestation of what Sigmar means to the people is completely changed. He is now 100% a warrior god. And he's also pretty much the only god they reference in the Empire book. That's it. So we have a good few years where all of the writers who have been hired by Black Library are receiving only the Empire Army List, most likely, and Sigmar. That's it. He rises and rises and rises in importance. All the other gods, Tal, Maor, Raya, Ranald, all of those are largely forgotten by most writers because they don't have access to the role-playing game. And the role-play game isn't published by Games Workshop, so they have no real interest in giving it to their writers. Meaning that they are all writing about the Empire. When they're talking about beating up the Chaos bad guys, it's almost always Sigmarites that are doing it, and it completely changes the tenor of how the Empire is presented. This is broken up a bit, though, by the studio, of all places, because Gav Thorpe steps in. Now, Gav Thorpe is a great lover of all things Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Warhammer, actually. He's read it all. He's done it all. He's been involved with it right from the beginning. And he did the Storm of Chaos, a deeply controversial campaign for some. But the Storm of Chaos went, hey, you know those warrior priests we've got in 6th edition, which absolutely should be there? They could be Ulricans too. And then pitched the Cult of Sigmar in a slightly different direction and said, Ulricans attack, Sigmarites defend. And Sigmar's character is changed in a single book, where Sigmar's character is much more about defending the borders of the Empire and protecting your mind against chaos, protecting the borders against chaos, where the Ulricans are all about charge. It's all about providing a nice dichotomy of arguments between those who are on one side and those who are on the other. He took the great arguments of Ulricans versus Sigmarites that have been presented in the roleplay game and he turned it into a Warhammer Fantasy Battle core thread. And that was great. And suddenly writers were given access to other gods. And they started creeping back into the novels again, which, as a reader of the time, was like, hey, they mentioned someone who isn't fucking Sigmar. Yes! For me, that was the best, because Sigmar had come to dominate most of the output that had come from Black Library in a variety of ways. Sometimes the other gods were mentioned, but not very much. And that got emphasized come Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2 in 2005. Now, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2 added all the gods from the first edition and said, you know what, they're still here. Now, that might sound uncontroversial to you, Tal, Raya, but at the time, there was a significant portion of the fan base that said those gods didn't exist in Games Workshop anymore. You know what it's like when Games Workshop rewrites something and everyone says, that's old lore. All of the gods were seen by many as old lore that didn't exist anymore and shouldn't be tapped upon. And fortunately, Games Workshop, when they decided to, well, it wasn't Games Workshop, it was Black Library. They opened their own new imprint called Black Industries to create the roleplay game. They took the license back for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and made it themselves. They hired in Green Ronin to do it, and Chris Pramis led a team of writers, and they brought all the gods and put them back in and put Sigmar now as a core deity. He's no longer sitting off at the side. He's now a core deity. And all the gods are added back in. We have ourselves a deep pantheon again. And Sigmar is given a deeper potential write-up. No longer just that Catholic thing, or no longer just the warrior priest. It could be all of those. Fortunately, that is 100% consolidated by a book that comes from Black Library right afterwards. And this is, I'm going to argue, possibly one of the most important books if you're interested in reading up about Sigmar. And that's The Life of Sigmar. Very difficult book to get hold of these days. It was a small book about so big. Do I have it here? I don't. It was a small book.
No, it's in your studio.
I actually have more than one copy. It's a small book about so big. It draws a lot of information from the second edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay as well, which is really nice because the writer who was involved with that, Matt Ralphs, helped by Gav Thorpe as well, it's worth noting, when they were deciding all the short stories about Sigmar that they would include in that, they very much drew on all of the existing lore. They wrapped it all up into one, and they tried to fill in the holes that the novels had made as well, because it's fair to say that the novels had taken Sigmar in a host of different directions. I'll give you just one example of that because we don't want to, in our sprawling intro, go into it too much. And the single example will be the Order of the Silver Hammer. So back in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay first edition, in The Enemy Within, in that seminal first book, they introduced the Order of the Silver Hammer, one of the many orders of the cult. Consider them like different factions, like you might get Franciscan monks inside the Catholic Church or some equivalent. And the Order of the Silver Hammer were wandering priests that went from place to place, sometimes warriors, sometimes not, spreading the word of Sigmar. And they had been turned into the Templars by the, who wrote Witch Hunter?
The Witch Hunter. Oh, the series?
Yeah, the Witch Hunter series. Anyway,
Warner.
Thank you. And he had completely rewritten the Order of the Silver Hammer. And that had caused a lore contradiction. He'd just taken a name that had existed already and rewrote it into his Templars and his Witch Hunters. They were never Witch Hunters originally. They were wandering warrior priests, I suppose. They would actually fit the warrior priest model far better than they do a Witch Hunter. But that then had to be incorporated. Life of Sigmar took a whole bunch of stories about Sigmar, combined them into one, took all of the stories that Graham had written all the way back and embellished them, and then added a whole bunch of new ones and created an entire story for Sigmar's complete life, right from the beginning when he was born, through confronting big black boars, to Kurgan Ironbeard, the high dwarf king that he met and got the hammer from when he saved him from the orc attack, the politics of Sigmar and the various tribes that he bound together, straight through to the Blackfire Pass battle. We'll be getting on to some of that relatively soon. And it covered it all in a neat little book and was ace, because it really went to town in a way that was also to hark back to what Sotek was saying right at the very beginning, in character. So that meant that it was an in-world piece, meaning that all of it could be wrong because it was beliefs. It was myth. It was legend. It wasn't certainty. And that was great. I remember reading the book at the time when it came out and going, oh, you've done a good job. Oh, well done. Very pleased about it. I was particularly pleased because I'd also been commissioned at that point to write about Sigmar. And I was in the process of collating everything ever written about Sigmar when that book came out. So I took that book. I was given a copy of it before it was released. And I added that to what would become the Tome of Salvation version of Sigmar that was presented in about 2007. But something released before that. And that was the Warhammer Fantasy Battle 7's version of the Empire Army List. And it again made a categorical statement that ended up causing mighty arguments for the Tome of Salvation. And it said this, and again, quote from Black and White. Graham McNeil, who was working in the studio at the time, said, Sigmar is a warrior god. Fair enough. To follow his creed is to live a life of war. And this book came out, and then I was left going, do I have to say that all Sigmarites are warrior priests, or can I have monks? Can I have people who are studying the word of Sigmar off in their own temples? Can I have all of these things? Or is this just a simplification for the army list? And the reply was, And I was like, seriously, I'm writing this, literally about to send it over to you. Seriously? And they were like, yeah, well, send it over and we'll, make a call on it. So I sent over a write-up that incorporated everything that had ever been written about Sigmar. You'll find that inside the Sigmar section in Tome of Salvation for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition. And there I tackled a host of things that had been brought up because so many people had assumed that Sigmarites were like the Catholic Church on the roleplay side. And also on the battle side, so many people had assumed that they were all warrior priests. And I had to try and combine it all and also include another major edition that had come back in 1999 for Mordheim, where we got Sisters of Sigmar. I wrote quite clearly to the developer Fantasy Roleplay at the time, there is literally nowhere in the background where it says that the entire cult is male, is it? The cult of Ulrich is mostly male, that's well known, but Sigmar isn't. But if you want me to crib off potential Catholic leanings, they should mostly be male with nuns as separate orders, to which they said no. The priesthood is absolutely egalitarian, was always meant to be, which, as it turned out, was not a lie. It was always supposed to be. Graham, when he first put it together, thought of it as an egalitarian cult that had men and women in it with relatively equal order. But most of the writers that came afterwards just filled it with men because that's what they kind of expected it to be. So I was like, cool, that's what I'll write to. So there's a nice little bit in there showing that many of the priests of Sigmar may take vows of chastity, but not all do. Different orders have got different rules, and that the cult in the Empire is huge. But I also added another couple of things because we weren't just simply collating everything that was there. We were trying to show how it also had the impact that Sigmar clearly had in the setting. And we added an extra detail for the Theogonists. Now, Theogonist is one of the many ranks in the cult of Sigmar. And Theogonist was marked out as someone who ruled one of the old world nations' cult of Sigmar sections. So there's a Theogonist of Kislev, a Theogonist for Bretonia, a Theogonist for Tilia. Although it was the patron deity of the Empire, the cult of Sigmar was shifted slightly to being the cult that believed it was the cult of humanity. It believed it was right, and they had the only god that had ascended from humanity, and thus all right-thinking humans should worship Sigmar. And it was an important change to make because Sigmar had changed in its weight so much over the course of the writing that had taken place over the course of the last 2 decades. So we had to show how that had reflected in the old world in our updated version for the cult. So that was super fun. And then I got my edits back, and they didn't change anything, which was nice. And I then questioned, Graham has said this about the cult of Sigmar, and we have to abide by the army lists. I've contradicted it. Our books contradict this, to which they said, we're cool with that. Okay, we're cool with it. And I was like, yeah, but that's possibly not going to be the case for all the writers who are receiving. They'll almost certainly receive the army list. So that's going to cause issues. These are your writers, because I was speaking directly to Black Library. So if you're cool with it, great. It's your jobs. It's not mine. I'm just a freelance. But you might want them to have access to other books, which was great because they did gain access to some of the other books that came from Black Industries. And it meant that at this point, there was a proliferation of not just slightly different versions of how the Cult of Sigmar was presented. It's during this whole bridging era, we got Esmer, if you know Esmer, as a different version, more of a politician style from the Cult of Sigmar. And that went in a very different direction for a wee while. Tome of Salvation came out. It completely changed it slightly. It took in everything that came before and said it could all exist and everything was good. And then we got the Time of Legends. And we've discussed the Time of Legends already, loosely, at the beginning of the stream. It's a set of novels by Graham McNeil. And he had bounced off the Sigmar as a warrior god, which he had largely done in the studio. He had not picked up all the extra bits that had come out in the interim since then. And he wrote his own stories, which not only was his right, it's what Black Library prefers. And he wrote over a ton of stuff. But he also added so much fucking cool. A nice mixture of new stories mixing with an overwrite of a host of things, making a completely different pitch as Sigmar as the man, rather than Sigmar as the god, which had been the core component of most of his writing up to that point, with the occasional Life of Sigmar diversion. He also overwrote some parts of the Life of Sigmar, which was definitely a choice that upset a lot of people in the fantasy roleplay side, because the people who write for fantasy roleplay are generally trying to incorporate everything, and they found it very hard to incorporate the Time of Legends, but it didn't matter because second edition came to an end. Third edition came out, and third edition literally didn't tackle it. Didn't tackle it at all. It just reiterated what had come out previously. Yep. They just went, it's not our problem. We will just write the cult of Sigmar is the warrior god, the warrior priests. They do the thing, and they went down the more Graham McNeil studio version because that's what they were told to do, and they were absolutely right to do so. And then some of the writers who were brought in muddied that up by saying, of course, there's other orders, and they do this, and they do that. So third edition added a great deal of depth, the Silence of Faith, and the extra books that came out for that. And that is where we would end it, if not for one other major thing. And unexpectedly, for many of the writers who were working on the game or who had worked in the past, Warhammer Fantasy Battle 8, underneath its entry for Warrior Priest, doesn't say it's only Sigmar. It mixes it all up. It says, yeah, Sigmar, and it provides rules for Sigmar people. But it says other cults do too. 8 re-established polytheism in the army list for the first time. That might sound insane.
Just in time for the world ending.
Pretty much for the first time. Previous books had sort of hinted at it, but they did not have this clear statement inside the Warrior Priest entry. And then when we hit the end times, Sigmar's character is given the importance that the previous 2 decades worth of build-up had pretty much given it. In that when we hit the end times, Sigmar was core. Now, this is where we take a small moment because my brief intro is coming to an end. This is where we take a small moment to go, he was nothing more than a regional deity. He was not an important god. But because of the choice of the Enemy Within campaign to make him the central component of their first detailed area, everybody wrote about him from pretty much that point onwards. His story is embellished. His background is embellished. The stories, because different writers don't necessarily read everything that came before, start branching off in different directions. We have Graham McNeil wandering in one direction. We have Matt Ralphs taking him in a very different direction. We have the roleplay game taking him in yet another direction, meaning that we have an entire tree worth of different versions of what Sigmarism is and who Sigmar was. Through the course of our Sigmar streams, because this is almost certainly just going to be the first, we're going to be diving into many of the somewhat contradictory stories from his real life. Now, Sotek is largely going to be concentrating over on the novels, I believe. I think that's your plan. Am I correct?
Yes.
Largely.
With some extra stuff, yeah.
With some extra stuff here and there as well, because they provide loads of cool extra stories and many of the characters that you will come to know and love from other places, where I'm far more interested in the overarching everything of it all. If any of this has caused any questions as we go through our big intro, please do ask. We have ended up with a Sigmar who becomes almost the core deity of Warhammer. He was just a tiny deity sitting on the side, and he is now the core deity of Warhammer. Come the end of the Warhammer setting, it's pretty much all that survives, as then whooshing up, we move into Age of Sigmar, and slowly but surely everything is recreated around it. But it's Sigmar, and it's his age, and it's him doing everything. And I would have preferred, personally, that we didn't have another Warhammer setting where it's the Emperor sitting at the heart doing everything. It'd be nice to have a different story, which is why I bring up do we really need to have a bearded white man as our core central figure? Although the Emperor is often depicted without beard, but you know what I mean. But yes, that is what we have. We move from what was originally nothing more than a barbarian king Christ type figure who is deified for his deeds, and then he is turned into everything that is Warhammer, and the entire story focuses around him in a similar way that 40k focuses around the Emperor. Gosh, that was a fair bit. Intro to Sigmar. Boom, I'll now shut up and say nothing else for the rest of the stream. Away you go, Sotek.
I really doubt that. But yeah, that is actually... It is a really important amount of information to go over because it kind of interestingly has a reflection within the actual universe itself of having this regional deity that builds up to quite literally becoming the overall literal god of humanity within a new setting where he is the central figurehead. It also reflects well of literally just, for all intents and purposes, a normal human being, a boy who's going to ascend to the point where he becomes enough of a threat that the dark gods are like, ooh, about dealing with him, which kind of has an interesting poetic parallel to it. But before I launch us into some actual
part 2
story aspects, we're going to get caught up on super chat stuff real quick. Fred Slipknot 9. I know we've had Lustria, yes, but what about Rathia, Prideria, Enviria, Greedia, Flothria, and Gluttoneria? Also, nice cat earphones.
Thanks, Fred Slipknot. And you know what? I have never noticed that before, and I'm never going to unsee it again. And I don't know if I should swear at you or not.
Yeah, I've had this thought pop into my head before, where I've looked at the name Lustria, and I've always wondered about what was going on in the head of the person that wrote that down, and if it ever occurred to them that there are just some people that, I mean, it's such a famous trope, the Seven Deadly Sins, that someone would look at that and be like, what is this continent about? Like, what's going on here? This hot, steamy jungle? What's going on over there?
It's hot and steamy.
Yeah. Charles CK, does the brand name Warhammer or Ghal Maraz itself come first? What's
Warhammer.
the basic timeline of events around those names way back in the day?
Okay, so it's Warhammer first. Warhammer first edition for the fantasy battle game, which was put together by Rick Priestley and was a host of rules for pretty much all of your miniatures. Second edition came along and tidied it all up. And then third edition came along and we got our first concepts of the Warhammer world being laced into it. But by that point, we already had Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay first edition. And Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay first edition is where we get all the core concepts that we're used to today. But Ghal Maraz, I don't think really hits until that seminal volume, The Enemy Within. The very first book.
There you go. Serpanza, I think Sigmar is a perfect example of how religions form, both in universe and real life. Stories of a notable person slowly grow and grow until he's not just a god, but the bestest god ever.
You know what, Serpanza? I actually agree. I was half tempted to make some real world religious parallels, because there are some parallels between how Sigmar has developed within Games Workshop to how various religions in the real world have also developed. There's also some parallels for how there are different conflicting stories within the lore of Sigmar to real world religions as well, just as a single one. Assuming you don't ascribe to the one writer version of the Bible, there's literally two versions of the creation myth in Genesis, two. In one version, man and woman are created at the same time. In the other version, woman is created from the rib of man. And different traditions have different answers for that. Some say, yeah, no, you're just misunderstanding it. Others say that's because the first edition is speaking to Lilith, not to Eve. And there's different versions of how that can be interpreted. And that, in turn, reflects over to Sigmar. And I think that's to Sigmar's benefit. Now, when I was saying that the writings for Sigmar often contradict each other, I don't see that as a bad thing, because we're dealing with a mythical entity here. We're dealing with a god, and the stories around gods inflate, change, and move over time. And that's the case in both the real world and inside the Warhammer world. So I have absolutely no issue with everything contradicting itself. I do have an issue with a particular story saying this is the only real story, because that's a bit of a nonsense, largely because Games Workshop itself doesn't believe that. Yeah, each writer is given the freedom to create and write the stories they want. When Graham McNeil came along, he wrote his version of what he believed the story of the Time of Legends of Sigmar should be, somewhat mirroring what they had been doing with the Horus Heresy, because that's what the Time of Legends largely was. What was the instigating events that moved into the core setting we know? 30k to 40k, Time of Legends into Warhammer. So they were making their own attempt to try and create their own version of the Horus Heresy and build something for Warhammer that was similar. And he was telling his story within that milieu. Does that mean that all writers after that will pay attention to it? It being Games Workshop? Probably not.
Yep. And yeah, I very much agree, Serpanza. And it is one of the things that makes Sigmar so fun. Is that you can look at it and go, I could completely understand how we get from point A and meander around a lot before we arrive at point Z. Which is great. Yay, 13. Sigmar is not a god. Oh, someone let an Ulrican in the room.
I actually considered making this a part of my intro. This was considered, and I didn't because I forgot to mention it. Bluntly. So this is a fascinating question, point, comment, because it's actually a point of contention not only within the Warhammer world, where there is the various heresies that go around the idea that Sigmar is not a god, never was a god, and so on, and the in-game, the actual people who are reading it and what they think. And many people who read it think Sigmar probably isn't a god and shouldn't be there. I'm going to be as blunt as I can be when I say that as far as the setting is concerned, he is a god. Absolutely, 100%. There is no doubt. Now, what form that god takes, how he manifested, there is a lot that we could discuss around that and not contradict the setting as it stands. But the setting as it stands very much makes it clear that Sigmar absolutely is a god.
Yeah, and what's funny is that, at least to me personally, is that you could really, even from that point, have an argument kind of until the end times rolled up, and was like, there he is.
Yeah.
If you go back and read like the Storm of Chaos has a very wiggly look at like, is he? Because Vulcan just loses, like flat out. Yeah. Archaon beats him.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said about the grey areas that were added through the course of 6th into 7th edition. And Gav in particular, Gav's great. I love Gav. Hi Gav, if you're out there. Gav added a lot of lovely stories that mixed throughout all of this, which really made you doubt exactly what the gods were or were not in Warhammer. But I will also note that if it wasn't for Gav, we'd have no elven gods. He made them all, barring Cain. He literally made them all. He just made them up. And the same that we wouldn't have any Kislev gods. He made them all for the little Kislev army list that he wrote. The extra depth to the Warhammer world deities was largely added by Gav, which is why I was really happy that he was in the middle of the 6th and 7th, a core component of much of the writing, because it meant that we didn't lose our broader pantheons. Instead, we kept them, and that was great.
Yeah, I very much highly agree. Mads, when Luther the Daddy Huss streams Sigmar's boy, someone's got a bald man fetish. But at some point we'll talk about Luther. Luther Huss is a really fascinating character. Not really within the scope of this stream. Also, if you like Luther Huss, you should really be watching Lawhammer, because he may or may not show up in that at some point. Sean Schultz. How does the comet become tied to Sigmar? Okay, this one's actually relatively simple.
Super easy.
That. Yeah, when Sigmar was born, his birth is heralded by the twin-tailed comet. And it was a really big astrological event that had ramifications all over the world, not just in the Empire, but in the Empire, a bunch of the tribal shamans and stuff were like, that's the gods saying that this child is destined for greatness. And it just so happened that he was.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Life of Sigmar book, it increases this by saying all manner of other portents were kicking around when he was born as well. It's worth noting, though, that in fact, all of the detail about this was originally popped in the Enemy Within book, where they went, here is the symbol, this is why the symbol exists, this is what it means, setting up what would later become Death in the Reich and their choices when they made Morsley be certain things and what it all set up. But later on, other writers would add that comet, the twin-tailed comet, that if we go with its original dating 30 years before the Imperial calendar begins, although the old world kind of messed that up a little bit.
Hopefully the old world fixes that in future editions.
It kind of messed that one up a little bit. But assuming that we stick with that, that was then ported over to all the other species around the world, because the reason that we have a dearth of Sigmar build-up after about the mid-90s when the Empire list comes out, up until the next one, is because they're expanding the rest of the world. And as they expand the rest of the world, they take the stories that they had there and forget to port it over. And it's not until the later army list they suddenly go, oh, wait a minute, no, this comet is now a core component of not just Sigmar, but the whole Warhammer world. And it's interesting how this comet begins to be tied into the stories of other factions and species around the world and becomes a core part of the celestial magic that will come to represent Sigmar later.
Yep. Morton Crescent, do you think it's telling that this all happened in the UK with the state religion of the Church of England, the monarch as the representative of God, etc., versus if it had been written somewhere else?
There is absolutely... it's not just telling, it's the cultural motifs that are being uplifted and copied over. They're not identical. When Graham wrote the original parts that he wrote for this, he didn't copy, paste, and put it over. What he did was he looked at what could be a realistic representation of a pantheon of gods and how it might manifest with Sigmar. So that was the first attempted write-up. But later on, it turned into pure warrior Sigmar, bosh, 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 bald-headed guys running around with hammers. That very much wasn't the initial write-up, and it changed over time. And then it sort of went back to its original writing in the later half. It's quite fascinating to see the complete evolution of how the Cult of Sigmar has moved.
Yep. Matt, Sotek, have you thought of showing Andy some of the mini lore legendary characters that some of the modders have made for the game? Oh, for a Total War or only official CA? So, maybe at some point that could be like a fun side thing to do, like on a Wednesday thing, talk about something like that, because modders have done a lot of really incredible stuff within the game, but it's also like a extremely long list, and we only have so much time, and there's lots of other things we like to do. So I don't foresee that being something that we would do unless there was like a really big push for it. So if you want to see that, be sure to let us know on like Discord and stuff, or Twitter or whatever. Just message us, because if we see that y'all are really interested in wanting to talk about something, we can react to that organically.
Absolutely.
But currently there are no plans for that. Psych. Sigmar overtaking the other gods and becoming a core deity is sort of like what Catholic did with other faiths when it was rising up. Yep.
I don't disagree. There's a lot of parallels that you can draw. Fortunately, it's interesting because it's more of a real world rise up rather than an in-game rise up. The in-game rise up sort of didn't happen. It just sort of went, it's Pantheon, end time, boof, Sigmar.
Yep.
The game version is quite different to the out-of-game version, where you can see how Sigmar rose to the prevalence that he got, even though in the setting, he never gets that, ever, until they blow it up. And they make him match the real-world view of Sigmar and how important he becomes to Games Workshop.
Necromancer Cobalt. So the spotlight on Sigmar was because the Empire became the main characters of the setting. Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, to a strong degree. It was the first army list that was written. It become pretty much the core setting for the novels coming from Black Library. Now, obviously, they started expanding outwards over the course of time and took other stories, but the core setting of the Empire really does dominate so many of the novels. And whenever one of the characters goes somewhere other than the Empire, it is often because they've come from the Empire. So, I don't know, Fleischer moving over into the Border Princes, or Brunner moving over into Bretonnia, or whatever other choices that you have, but they're often Empire characters. And this wasn't the case right at the very beginning. If you take, for example, the Orfeo trilogy take place all over the Old World because the Old World was the setting. But the Conrad trilogy, 100% Empire. Everything from Kim Newman, pretty much all of it was centered in the Empire. And Kim Newman defined the tone of Warhammer Fantasy roleplay in a way that is incontrovertible. So many writers only cite him as the core writer. And again, if you want to find his books, you might find his books under the name Jack Yeovil, because that's the pen name that he used back then. And he was 100% Empire. And because of that, the Empire became synonymous with Games Workshop's version of Warhammer, even when they had all these other things out for the army list and you're playing orcs and goblins or dark elves or whatever else. When you turn to the stories, almost always the Empire.
Yep. Rubber Roser Orc, could Sigmar microwave a burrito so hot he himself could not eat it? So, okay, it's a joke, but what I want to say is, don't confuse Sigmar and many of the gods in the Warhammer world as being big G type god. Of like, in the sense that, oh, well, surely they are infinite levels of power, therefore they can create a rock so big that they can't lift it. That kind of paradox. A lot of the Warhammer gods actually won't fall into that trap of like, imaginative argument, because they tend to have very specific realms of influence or very specific, like, quote unquote, power sets of that. Like Sigmar, for all he's awesome, is not like an infinitely powerful entity within the Warhammer world. There are express limits to what he's capable of.
Yeah, absolutely. The gods in Warhammer are clearly extremely limited, and if you go with some versions of the background, growing more limited as time progresses and chaos rises. That being the case, the gods should not be perceived as these great all-powerful entities that can do whatever they wish to do. They cannot. It's much more complicated than that.
Yeah. So I would say he absolutely could make a burrito so hot that it would burn him.
Sure.
Red Salamander, happy birthday to Lorehammer. Hope all's well. I think we're doing pretty okay.
Yeah. I'm moving. I'm still really rather ill at this end, but I'm just pretending I'm not, and we're seeing how that goes.
Phil,
I'm alive.
Yeah, and that's good. We're very thankful for that.
Yeah, me too.
So,
me too.
Would you say that Sigmar has turned into a protector god of humanity rather than just the protector god of the Empire? Do Sigmarites try and convert foreigners, or do they consider Sigmar an ethnic religion?
Okay, that's a great question, Phil, because it's one that I was actually tackled in the second edition of the game as well. So first, as a patron god of the Empire to the patron god of humanity, that's how this people who follow Sigmar style themselves. They believe that should be the case, whether that is the case or not. Would many people outside of the Empire view Sigmar as nothing more than a provincial god? Absolutely. That is also the case. But does that mean that Sigmarites thus don't have missionaries? No, they do. They've got people who go out of their way to not just spread the word of Sigmar, so to speak, in a very Catholic style way, but to actually do Sigmar's work. And Sigmar's work is obviously opposing chaos, greenskins, undead, or whatever else Sigmar happened to kick in. It's their job to do it, and they do go far beyond the borders of the Empire. But it is worth noting that the tone of Sigmar's cult was strongly influenced in its mid-noughties writing to start being more of the patron protector. So you often find a lot of the art around this era as well. They'll have things like books on their forehead. And there's a reason for that. They did this in the real world as well, where they'd have various holy verses that they would pop in their head because that would keep them devout, pure, or whatever other reason they believed they were holding things out from their minds. But the Sigmarites were also doing this. The protection aspect of Sigmarism became somewhat core in much of its artistic and writing. Artistic development, and writing, meaning that we got ourselves a relatively clear difference between what turned into the warrior cult of Sigmar, which was largely protective, defensive, shields up boys, and the warrior cult of Ulrich, which was all about getting the blood to flow and charging and being far more aggressive, where the Sigmarites were seen to be far less that. Sigmarism had a slightly different tone.
Matthew, the twin-tailed comet makes me wonder how many babies were born on that day. How many were conceived? Yeah, that's a good
question.
Thing to wonder. It's a great question.
And it's certainly something that would make for an interesting story. And there's nothing saying that it's just a symbol of good. It is a symbol more of interesting times, because as we note, this is a symbol that is used by other factions elsewhere, the twin-tailed comet of Sigmar, in a variety of different ways to show that something important has happened. Important doesn't mean good.
Yeah, the celestial body that is the original twin-tailed comet, one of the things that it's almost a shame we never got to see more explored is that you kind of get the idea that and he's right in that it's a herald of significant times, not good times. Because there are a couple additional times that something with a twin-tailed like comet shows up, but the rest of them that we actually see beyond the original one are they tend to be meteors that actually impact the planet for various dramatic moments. Such as, like Mordheim getting slammed, and then of course what all the shenanigans that go down in the end times. One of the things that is kind of an unexplored question, which I have a lot of fun theorizing about, but there is no actual answer, was what was the actual original twin-tailed comet? Because it was unique, which makes for really interesting things to wonder about and what influence it might have had on the wider world.
Totally.
Ricky Chapman, apologies for being late. Where do you think Sigmar's body is? Did he even leave a body when he became a god? That's a great question that is argued about a lot in the universe.
There's a reason that it's argued about as well. It's because Games Workshop have provided more than one answer. In my introduction, I mentioned Empire in Flames. Empire in Flames was the conclusion to the Enemy Within campaign written by Carl Sargent. And it it actually tells you what happens to Sigmar, bluntly. It very clearly states when Sigmar effectively holds off a greater demon and ascends into godhood, and makes it relatively simple in black and white terms what happens. This gets not just overwritten, it gets completely overwritten. The entire story that's presented in The Empire in Flames is roundly ignored by later books and is just completely forgotten, to the point that generally most people, when they discuss that book, say something like, yeah, it could have been better, couldn't it? Not necessarily the best book. When Graham Davis returned and we were discussing how to rewrite the Enemy Within campaign, we were never going to take the Enemy in Flames route. We were going to take Empire in Flames route, pardon me. We were going to go in a very different direction. Now, the book that eventually got published is not the book that either of us intended to write. Somebody else picked it up and went in a different direction. But that's neither here nor there. The core part here is, where would Sigmar's body be? There isn't a Sigmar's body anywhere, according to some. In others, he literally died when he ascended, and his body was left in the cave where he ascended from. In others, it's something a little bit more saint-like, where his body stays perfect. Yeah, there's as many stories as there is real-world stories of real-world religious figures, in that religion and people's beliefs have changed the nature of it. And to make it really complicated, if you wish to do so, the Warhammer world is one where belief matters, where emotion is at the core of what the realm of the gods, the aether, swirls around and makes real. So it's very possible that Sigmar the god literally did none of those things, but later he did, because of the very nature of the weirdness of how magic works in Warhammer. So you could have a whole variety of different interpretations, and they could arguably all be correct. And again, I think somewhat uniquely for Sigmar, this is actually for the betterment of the story, because broadly speaking, you don't want to tie it down too much. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't do that for your own individual stories you're making. If you're running a game of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, for example, I'm doing that just now on Lawhammer. We're doing a completely crazy take on the Enemy Within. I do mean it's crazy. We go places that Graham and I never would have gone, ever. It's proper over the top. But I'm doing that on purpose, because most people do a very grounded version. And in that version, there is an actual answer for what happened with Sigmar, because the Enemy Within campaign ended up being the story of what happened with Sigmar. And I'm going to drop a little factoid that very few people know. Ooh. So when I was discussing this with Graham, and we were going through what are we going to do with Sigmar, Graham dropped a story I just didn't know. And I knew a lot of stories by that point, because I've been working on Warhammer for freaking ages. And he said, you know, when I first did Sigmar, you know who Sigmar was? And I was like, no. He's like, he's the guy in the box in the Warhammer cover. I was like, what? Warhammer 1, Warhammer 2, and Warhammer 3. That's Sigmar. I was like, what? What? He's like, that's Sigmar. That was Sigmar. Warhammer 1, 2, and 3 was Sigmar. And I'd like to, you know, use that somehow, because that's what we thought Sigmar was. So if you go take a look at the covers for Fantasy Battle 1st edition, 2nd edition, and 3rd edition, that was, as far as Graham, who made Sigmar, is concerned, his first ideas of what Sigmar was. Now, it's quite likely that there are a lot of people out there, particularly those who are in Games Workshop, who go, no, it's not! It absolutely isn't. There are some who say it's Harry the Hammer. There are others who say it's someone completely different.
That's wild.
And it causes arguments amongst some people. But as far as Graham was concerned, that's what was in his head as he was doing it. And you can't get more firsthand than that, because he freaking wrote it. So that's an interesting little aside for you. That was what he first thought of as Sigmar when he was making his first version of the god.
That's super interesting.
Isn't that wild? Yeah, it's a wild detail.
Yeah. So, grabbing the last of these, Ricky Scotty, mainstream, Neko Nya. Andy, yeah, indeed. Hammond, what does he? Oh, hello, Hammond. What does he say? Sigmar. Yeah. You figured that would be probably a heretical joke that gets children slapped across the side of the head in universe a lot. So, an hour and a half in, and I can finally start talking about Moral Life of Sigmar.
I did warn you before we started it, Mike. Sprawl.
So, Sigmar is an interesting thing. So if we turn back the clock, right? We turn back the clock 2,500 years to the space that will later become the Empire. And to put it really, really bluntly, the world that Sigmar was born into sucked if you were a human. It was not a good place. We were, of course, the time of woes had been stretching on for centuries. The Dwarf Empire was not in a good place. Much of it had crumbled and was struggling significantly. So the dwarfs, who had kind of taken on a benevolent type relationship with many of the humans, couldn't really help them a lot of the time. They were holed up in their mountains.
I'll drop in here with a relatively strong. Dwarves didn't give a crap about them at all, mostly. There's a lovely little bit written into the Tome of Salvation there, which is pretty much explaining the whole concept of the word umgi, okay, which means shoddily made. And they'd encountered some of these early humans, and they were like, yeah, no, they're just not worth your time. They just make crap. They are crap. True. They are worse than anything that is worth spending any time with. And generally speaking, the stubbornness of dwarves had left them to pretty much stick with the idea that humanity was not worth its time. They were shoddily made, their stuff was shoddily made, and they themselves were short-lived and inconsistent.
Yeah, like there was trade between them, but there was nothing like fighting side by side or anything along those lines. Like they had some mutual enemies, which is why trade was okay with them. But the big thing is that because the dwarves were kind of locked up in the mountains, that meant that the things that the dwarves did not like, that also preyed on humanity, were exploding everywhere. The beastmen were extremely prolific in the forests and were dominating pretty much all of the deep wood. You had a lot of these tribes were very warlike, and as we've talked about a lot in prior streams, were originally tribes of chaos. They were tribes that came from the northern lands, then moved their way down, and they were warlike tribes that fought each other brutally. The fights between the Teutigans and the Unberigans and the Norsey and the Asaborns and all these other tribes were nasty, nasty conflicts. They were not friendly to one another the vast majority of the time. They competed very heavily over resources and materials and land. But the Unberigans had set up in a nice little place in the vague vicinity of modern-day Reichland. If you believe some version of the story, they set up where Altdorf currently is, which was Reichdorf back then.
I got one little detail to add there, just to make sure that you all understand, because for many of you, this will be unfamiliar terms, things you don't know. Sigmar is about 2,500 years before the world blows up. So that's the era we're talking about. And the tribes of Sigmar are all the tribes of humanity that were in the area of the Reich Basin, in the modern-day empire, approximately, that he binds together. Now, one of those tribes is the Unberigans. That's the tribe he comes from. There are a host of other tribes as well. Teutigans, Azaborns, Udosis. There's a bunch of them living there, all in there, and they are at war. It's very much Warhammer, as you'd expect. Some of them are less warlike, some of them are more warlike. All of them have got their own individual deities, and they've been in this area for about 800 years. So this is not they've just arrived type thing. They've been in the area for a very long time. And it's worth noting that they come in at least 3 migrations. One migration is across from the south, one is across the World's Edge Mountains, and another one is across somewhere unspecified. The Teutigans in particular, they're the ones that become known for modern-day Middenland and Middenheim, Boris Todbringer, for those of you who know your Boris lore. They were arguably the most warlike, and they came across the World's Edge Mountains, and they were a Chaos tribe. Of that, there's no doubt. And the others that came in from other directions may or may not have been, but it seems exceedingly likely that the Unberigans were probably once one of the tribes of the north as well, who are a Chaos tribe. So just to make sure that's clear, it's 800 years worth of humanity being in this area, warring against each other and warring against everything else and around them. And it is a pretty simple time. We're talking wattle and daub huts. We're talking very simple environments, but they have complete understanding of religion. It's also worth noting at this point, because of the Azaborn tribe to the south, who have strong links down to Tilia, they also have the written word. Now, that written word is held by priests of Verena in particular, the goddess of wisdom, and they are held largely in what is now modern-day Nuln. So worth noting all those little details just so we get a bit of contextualization for the crazy Conan-like image that Sigmar will soon be bringing to this as he takes over the local tribes.
Yeah. So Sigmar is born into this environment. And one of the things that's notable is that in this particular snapshot of time, of all the problems that the peoples of this land are facing, the greenskin problem is becoming notably worse. It's becoming a lot worse. Greenskins are showing up in unprecedented numbers. They're flooding through Blackfire Pass and coming down from the mountains. Something has got them stirred up. Now, what they don't know that we know and can kind of speculate a bit about is that one of the really interesting things that happened in the world not too long before this was the Black Orc Rebellion over in Mingled Zarnagrund, where the Chaos Dwarfs nearly were wiped out, and they kick out all the Black Orcs and a lot of other Greenskins, which had a huge impact on the world at large. Because not only did you have this new species of Greenskins running around that were very good at unifying other Greenskins and kind of like smacking heads and getting them ordered and getting them to actually focus on an objective, but it also resulted in a lot of greenskins coming out in the world that the Chaos Dwarfs had taught various concepts and techniques to. Where like smithing, which granted, greenskin smithing is very different than what you'll see in a lot of parts of the world, but actual greenskin smiths were now out and about. And greenskin technology, for all that it is, took a big leap forward. And this results in a lot of massive waves around the world, but one of the very heavily speculated ones is that these Black Orcs start coming west and hit into the Badlands, and they basically organize the Greenskins of this time and aim straight for Blackfire Pass. Under a really, really big, ugly, powerful orc by the name of Urgluk Bloodfang, who I would guess is probably a Black Orc. It's not confirmed what kind of orc he is in the stories. He's just there. But I would be shocked if he wasn't a Black Orc.
I think it's very likely. And I think if we were coming at it again and taking a look at trying to understand the enormity of the Goblin Wars that had plagued the dwarves ever since the War of Vengeance. So they've been at war for like ever, as far as most of the dwarves are concerned, and hold after hold after hold have been falling. The dwarves are now literally gripping on to the edge of their civilization by the tips of their fingers and almost falling off. They are in trouble, a lot of trouble, and the Greenskins are amassing big time. And we're not talking about your classic Wa, and most people think of their classic Wa and they think of the a sudden rise, the flood of orcs moving through an area, or greenskins et al., and then fracturing when the leader is killed. We are talking about the culmination of centuries of greenskin dominance. And it's coming to an end for the dwarfs. And this is enormous for what Sigmar will eventually do, because, to put it bluntly, without Sigmar, there'd be no dwarfs. And this is something that's going to occur through his lifetime. He is born into a world where the greenskins are on the rise, and the greenskins are massively dominant. Indeed, his birth is dominated by greenskins also.
Yep, which, so all that to lead up to say, Sigmar's birth ends up being a really unpleasant event. In that when the Twin-Tail Comet shows up, a bunch of shamans get together to try and kind of figure out what it is, and they kind of come to a universal-ish decision that, oh, you know what? It's saying that Sigmar is going to be super duper awesome, that he's going to, great events are going to herald around him. But one of these, depending on which version of the story you look at, according to one of the versions of the story, the most elder of the shamans takes a reading and he says, ooh, no, according to what I just read, the boy and his mother are about to suffer a terrible death.
Yeah, they're going to die.
And the king of the Unbergans at the time, Bjorn, goes, oh, well, no thanks. We know a witch. We know a really spooky woman that lives out in the wilds who is very, very, she is very heavily coded like a Kislevite hag witch, but she's not a Kislevite hag witch, but she is definitely,
she's a hedge witch.
Yeah.
She's a hedge witch.
But she's a,
if you look into the deeper lore for hedge witch, she's a hedge witch.
Yeah. She's a mean old lady, but they try and go out to see her. and depending on which version of the story you read, things go down. But the important thing is they get attacked by greenskins. And during the attack, Sigmar's mother is killed, but she gives birth to Sigmar in the fighting. There's a quote that is literally like that Sigmar is born amidst the blood and gore of humans and orcs mixed together, which is gross, but a very strong image for
and I think is a core component of Sigmarism that's often forgotten. And I think that we should just take a moment to realize that at its core, from the very beginning of both its writing and also its later explanation and further development, Sigmar is an anti-greenskin god, not anti-chaos. Anti-chaos is something that was added significantly later in all the forms of writing, whether it's the roleplay game, the novels, the stories, that all came afterwards. To begin with, he is born in blood with greenskins howling to either side and his dad literally kicking in the great yellow-tusked orc that's about to take him out. But again, depending on the story you go with, because there's more than one version. In some versions, they don't even involve going to some crazy old hedge witch who's out in the wilds. It's literally just a greenskin attack on Reichdorf. Reichdorf is the old name for the capital of Altdorf, and there's no hiking out somewhere because of all the holy signs. It's just greenskins attack. He is born in blood. But the important part is that born during greenskin attack. Whether he was out in the wilds, whether he was in Reichdorf, whether he was in a completely different part of the empire, it doesn't really matter. What matters is his birth, which is heralded by this great comet moving through the sky, is 100% awful. And his mother dies in pretty much every single tale, and his father is responsible in most of them for saving his life and ensuring that he doesn't fall to the greenskins that are there. And he shows them off because, you know, he's Conan's dad.
Yep, and I mean, Bjorn's a pretty kick-ass individual on his own. He knows how to fight with an axe. So Sigmar's born, and he's raised in, depending on which version of the story that you're looking at in universe, and Reichdorf is what most out-of-universe stories agree with, but within universe, there's a hilarious amount of people that argue vigilantly that no, Sigmar was from my neighborhood, not your neighborhood.
And I think that's worth making exceedingly clear. That in-game, the myths around Sigmar are many. And you will find that, particularly if you go down through the roleplay game, there are lots of different manifestations of these myths. The most obvious ones are, say, Ubersreich. As far as Ubersreich's concerned, a great town in the south of Reichland, Sigmar was born there. And they justify that in a variety of ways. For example, that's where the witch was that he went to. Reichdorf is not where he was born. It was Ubersreich. But there are different versions of the tales. So is that true? Is something else true? Who can really say? But the important truisms that lie behind it is largely the more important part of the story as a whole, really. And that is born in blood, raised in somewhere in modern day Reichland.
Yeah. So Sigmar grows up in the Umbergan tribe. It's like we've talked about, it's a very warlike existence. Sigmar learns to fight really, really young. And there are stories of him fighting and killing greenskins. Well, there are some stories that are kind of ridiculous of him killing like goblins and greenskins when he's literally like a baby, like child, like 5 years oldish. But the more realistic myths have him actively going to battles and having to learn how to fight and survive at the age of 10.
I'll add in some specific call-outs. Life of Sigmar, for example, marks him as being 10 years old when he first pairs a hammer. The very first time he ever picks up a hammer and uses that instead. And he's doing that when he's sparring with an older boy who frequently kicks living crap out of him. And he goes into a frenzy, into a fury, and takes out this much bigger individual. According to the Life of Sigmar version, he doesn't really go against external threats until he's a teenager. A slightly different version to the far more religious version, where they're often depicting him from like a ridiculous age, coming hammer swinging from the age of 2 or some equivalent nonsense.
I want to say there's like a reference to the Hercules myth of strangling the snakes, with him like strangling a goblin when he's like a babe or something. But But
yeah, it's most certainly some interesting tales. But broadly speaking, he is brought up in a deeply dangerous environment and taught to fight from a young age, but also taught not just that, but he is a clan chief to be. He's going to be the king. And his father, Bjorn, is the king. Now, they'll use different terms in some of the background. They'll say clan chief, or they'll say chief of the Amberigans. But the most common term right from the beginning was king. And then when you move back to the end, is also king. It's in between that they mix it up with lots of chiefs. So broadly speaking, he will become the king of the Amberigan tribe and more. And as a king, he is also taught to do something which is not often discussed, and that's to treat to the gods. Now, this is something that you might go, what now? It's because they didn't really have the concept of priests in the same way that they do today. This is brought up in a variety of books, where generally the clan leader is the one who needs to lead the ceremonies for the local groups, meaning that the clan chief is responsible for this, and his father would be the one who would appeal to the gods in dark times, and he is in turn taught to do this. So from a very early age, religiosity of a variety of kinds is hard baked into him, in particular the general idea of appealing to Ulrich, because they were warlike, and Ulrich was the god of war as far as they were concerned at this point. The god of frenzied attack, which very much spoke to what Sigmar was like, and his father constantly saying things to him along the lines of, calm down, boy. A king needs to be calm and careful, which pops up in a variety of the small side stories.
Yeah, that so a reoccurring thing with Sigmar, which becomes really important later in his life, but it's very important to focus on early, is that Sigmar has a big, almost Greek flaw, which is his wrath. Sigmar gets fucking angry sometimes. He has that berserker fury, which, like Andy said, in virtually all versions, his father tempers as best he can. Where, like Andy talked about, that time where he picks up the hammer and strikes a fellow human, that's covered in a number of stories. It comes from Graham McNeil's version as well, where in the Graham McNeil version, he literally strikes at his opponent, I think while his opponent's not looking at him, because he gets so angry while he's down on the ground because he just lost a fight, rises up and strikes him and breaks his arm. And his father's like, you can't do that. Like, you have got to have control of your emotions if you're going to be leading this tribe, because if you just lose yourself like that to anger, you're going to get everybody killed. And that's something you'll see reoccur a lot through Sigmar's life, is that he gets really fucking angry, and when he loses control, it never goes well. He always will make a cataclysmic mistake when he loses himself to his berserker fury.
Yeah, I agreed completely. And I think that it also speaks to the gentle references to the fatal flaws that are often written into the 40k core characters sitting at the top in the 30k era. They're doing something similar with Sigmar here, although it was done before their attempt to effectively Horus Heresy it all up, because this was clearly written into the earlier versions of Sigmar as well, before Graham McNeil came along and added much more cool detail to it. But broadly speaking, yes, Sigmar's got a temper problem.
Yeah, so big dramatic moment that we kind of skipped to next. Sigmar has a good number of friends. I'm not going to focus too much on them, but like any person that grows up in a warlike society, you tend to have a band of brothers that you form around you, a band of allies. And Sigmar, the big ones that are important for the sake of his early stories, is there's a guy named Trinoventes, Trinoventes, something like that, who's the first really, really big important one, because when Sigmar is 15, he gets his first, depending on which version of the story you look at, 15 is the first time that he leads a fight to go out and strike at some greenskins who are causing problems in the area. And as Sigmar goes out and has this big fight, he is actually, wait, no, the first story would be the boar, wouldn't it?
Yeah, Black Tusk.
Black Tusk. Yeah, so Black Tusk the boar, which is very much a to me very much screams Odysseus, with Odysseus killing the boar of Athena. It's very much that, where there is a big old nasty boar named Black Tusk who is colossal. Like, we're not, we're talking like a giant greenskin pig, not your typical regular boar, and you have this big ugly fight between them and the boar. Though interestingly, in the kind of legendary story of Black Tusk, while Sigmar and his allies could have killed it, Sigmar ends up not doing so.
Yeah.
He doesn't kill the boar, he spares it. Instead, getting it to actually calm down after they have this conflict with it, and spares it and causes it to just sort of relax. He removes a spear that had been thrown to the boar's hide earlier, and it just sort of wanders off in the woods. And Sigmar that's often heralded in like the religious texts as a great moment for Sigmar, that he didn't win through battle lust. Instead, he won through, like his father taught him, being a good king, using words and being calm and using his actions to win a battle without shedding needless blood. Because if he had continued to just fight Black Tusk, it's very likely that him and or some of his friends would have died. Whereas they're all able to escape alive because he's able to spare this creature instead of fighting it to the bitter death, which is very interesting, because if you would think if they're pulling as much from, because to me, like, once again, it screams very much of the Athenian boar. That story is about how Odysseus uses his cleverness to kill the boar, which was a magic boar that couldn't be killed otherwise, which is an interesting twist on a really, really popular trope.
It's also, it speaks to the myths of the Warhammer world as well, because boars are often laid into the realm of Tal. In many respects, it can be easily interpreted as a general discussion about Talabic landers rather than necessarily a boar. And that's one of the things that we should always look at whenever we're discussing Sigmar's life rather than Sigmar's, let's say, myth. And that's that most of his life is tied through to something that could be interpreted another way. And that should be done. You should try to look at it in more than one way, because people in the Warhammer world would. And to simply interpret it as a single thing is to get stuck as a Sigmarite in some respects. The Sigmarites absolutely claim that the big giant boar was there, Sigmar spared it, and isn't that great? And it also showed his dominance over Tal, which they'll 100% claim, because Sigmar is more important than Tal, where Talites will say something very different. And indeed, some of them will have their own stories that say, no, Sigmar was a barbarian who was losing it, and he went to war with us as a kid, and we handed him his ass and sent him off. And that turned into the big story of Black Tusk. Nonsense. So there's different versions, and we should always try to mix it up, because that makes it feel more like a mythic entity rather than something which everybody knows. The stories of our own mythic entities are deeply contradictory, are deeply weird sometimes, and that's to their, in the case of being historical figures, difficulty, but absolutely is what mythic entities become. And I think for Sigmar, we should always try to keep our eyes open to that sort of thing.
Yep. And next, earlier than you may suspect, is the big one, where so Sigmar turns around 15-ish, and this is the moment where his life gets put in an altered course that will change everything, when a group of greenskins attacks some Unburrogan people and holdings. Sigmar gets to launch a raid back at the greenskins, and what he does not know is that these greenskins had not just hit the Unburrogans, but had also attacked the dwarfs. And through some either nightmarish trickery and cleverness or a good amount of luck, the greenskins had managed to successfully capture alive High King Kurgan Ironbeard of the dwarfs and much of his entourage.
Who happened to be down there, which is always an interesting
what they were doing anywhere in that vicinity is a mystery for the ages.
I'll tell you why. It's because the world had not been formed in the writers' minds by this point, so they didn't need to justify it. They just went, High King of the Dwarves, away it goes, because that's what Graham wrote. If we look at this, by this point, we've got a young teenage Sigmar who has already been blooded and given his shield. This means he's already led his own people to war at the age of 15, so that when his father dies and goes to war, he will then be respected by the other shieldsmen inside their household. So by this point, he's already gone to war in pretty much every single version of the tale. We're no longer dealing with someone who is a neophyte when it comes to kicking living crap out of something. By this point, he's quite used to leading raids out with his peers. He's quite used to warfare, and he rescues the High King. It's really funny if you just take a look at the original write-up for this, which was written way back when, all the way back in 1986, when it's pretty much, yeah, he saved King Kurgan's life. King said, thanks, here's your hammer, away we go. And that's pretty much it. Absolutely no awareness at that point that there is no logical reason for the High King to be kicking anywhere near where Sigmar would be at all, because it wasn't needed at that point. Indeed, the Dwarf Kingdoms weren't even properly understood at this point. They just didn't really realize what they were saying. And later writers have never justified it. They have never explained why the High King was hundreds of miles away from where any good, sensible High King should be during wartime when their entire populace is nearing extinction and besieged in 100 places, but he happened to be kicking around in the countryside having a bit of fun when he was captured by greenskins. It's always amusing to me whenever I view that story.
Yeah, so
I love it.
Why or why not he's manifested in that region? This story is always really fun because some authors have taken some really fun whacks at how the particular situation goes down as far as Sigmar and his lads coming down attacking the orcs. Where I believe if you have the Graham McNeil version, you have a big black orc war boss who's leading the sword. Which the reason that's important is that Sigmar and many of his tribesmen had never at that point encountered a black orc. And you have this fight where Sigmar and his bronze weaponry, it points out, are trying to attack a black orc. And think about what a black orc is, right? You're talking about a 7-8 foot horrible monster that's a very simian big brute who's covered head to toe in heavy, like, iron plates. Like, a bronze weapon is just not going to do it. You're not going to do anything to that orc. And that's kind of how it goes down. And then Sigmar ends up making his way to the area where the dwarfs are. And I always love the version where it mentions that King Kurgan somehow manages to get to Ghal Maraz and throws it to Sigmar, saying, "Cat!" throws the Warhammer to him. And with a runic Warhammer in his hands, Sigmar obliterates what's left of that black orc and the tribe and saves King Kurgan. Now, what's interesting to me to really think about, and I imagine Andy can add a little bit to this, is that when this story was originally written, I can't imagine that the Warhammer was what it becomes, of like Ghal Maraz being this forged by more than likely forged by an ancestor god, legendary runic hammer of a king, just kind of.
Yeah, no, it was just a runic hammer. At first glance. However, by the time the Enemy Within campaign was completed, it no longer was. It was the Warhammer. And it was significantly more powerful than the Warhammer that we get later. Ghal Maraz, as presented inside both the war games and the computer games, is a wuss in comparison to what Empire and Flames had. It was quite literally Mjolnir. You could throw it, had great runes of death all over it. It had all manner of horrors on it, and it came back to your hand every time you threw it. The Hammer of Sigmar was a proper mythic weapon, and it got very much watered down as we moved into Warhammer Fantasy Battle 4th edition, where it turned into an automatically wounding weapon that, was all right. Ignores your armor, sure. It was pretty lame by comparison. It had a full page of rules for the fantasy roleplay game, and it was kick-ass. So the story here, I find it fascinating because there is more than one version now, because we have versions of this story where dwarves come and appeal to the camp of humans to find their king. There's other ones where they literally chance upon them. There's some where he's already, by this point, the king of the Umberigans. And others, he's not the king yet, and his father Bjorn is yet to die. We have multiple versions here. And again, I suggest this is a strength, not a weakness for the overall stories, because it makes it much more multifaceted and interesting for individual games to then go, well, this order believes this order believes this group of Sigmar leaning folk, they believe this instead. And I think that the multiple authors that have tackled this give us more than enough opportunity to present lots of different versions for how this could have occurred. Inevitably, if you want to create an individual version that did happen, you're free to do so. But at this point, he's a teenager. He's likely the king, and he's hard. He's a living example of what a young warrior tribesman human aspires to be, and has been fighting pretty hard for at least a couple of years or so. He's already relatively special, attempting to follow in his father's footsteps.
Yeah, I want to say, I think in the Life of Sigmar version, he's king at this point, but in the Graham McNeil version, he's not.
Yeah, indeed.
But now, what's really interesting about this that I like to think about, if you think about what Andy talked about earlier when we were discussing the dwarves and their relationship to humanity, and if you've watched our other prior Lorebeard streams about when we talk about dwarves, particularly the Slayer stream, this is a fascinating situation to imagine High King Kurgan in, where this race, humans, the Umgi, not a flattering, pretty speciesist term, has just had his life saved, and that of his entourage, and therefore kind of the fate and the path of Karasakarak, and therefore the entirety of the Karazankor, has been saved by a teenage human boy, which is a really bizarre mixture of shame and gratitude for a dwarf to be in.
I love this story. I don't necessarily love how it's always been told. I love the story because we have ourselves a situation where we have a young king who saves a high king's life. And this is an event which really reverberates through all of Warhammer's writing, because it was there at the very beginning when they first pitched down what the Warhammer world would be, and they made their first stab at writing a full area, the Empire, and the core legend was young Sigmar saved the High King, and the dwarves and humanity, the Empire, would be tied together forever because of this. Right down to the Imperial cross symbol that you see all over various Empire troops. The bottom part of that cross represents dwarfs. That's a core component of what the Empire's identity is. It's linked through to the dwarfs. And the whole setup of the Empire with the High King, or in their case, the Emperor, over all of the kings of the holds, or in the Empire's case, all of the Electra counts, is just duplicating what the dwarfs do. The initial Empire is intrinsically a copy of the dwarfs, completely right down through it. Sigmar is a Devonger. Now, if you don't know what that is, let's quickly cover that. It's worth noting. Devonger means dwarf friend. And dwarf friend is not just simply, "Oi, he's a friend of dwarves, eh?" When you are named dwarf friend by the High King, it means all dwarves are your ally now. Sigmar is properly respected by the High King. He looks at what he did and he names him Devonger, which means all dwarves will view him as an honorable ally. The weight that is attached to that is enormous, and Sigmar bears it. And not only bears it, uses that later. He is a special individual, even in this early version. Now, could the tale have been inflated? The answer I am going to very bluntly state is no. This is an event that occurred in the Warhammer world. This isn't a legend. It's in the dwarf records of their high kings. It's marked. Sigmar is Devonger. The Empire is our ally. And they never break that. Oh, they skirt it a lot. There's lots of grudges involving lots of individuals, but the Empire, Sigmar's Empire, is their ally. But not only this, the Sigmar cult also fully represents this. Every single one of their core top leading members have dwarf names. That's something that's often forgotten. The Grand Theogenist always takes a dwarf name or an epithet, much like the Pope in the real world takes on a new name when he becomes Pope to represent what he's going to be. The Grand Theogenist and the Archlectors do the same, and they take on bits of dwarf. Volkmar the Grim, or Yori, who was named for one of the High Kings who came before him. All of them are named for dwarves. All of them respect dwarves. The dwarf language is hard-coded into much of what Sigmarites do, along with, of course, Classical, which is where they got the very first language from the Vrenians, as we mentioned earlier. Cut a long story short here, Sigmar does something that is so fundamentally impressive that the High King marks it in the records and marks him as the Wonger. Doesn't actually matter what the individual points were. It also doesn't necessarily matter whether he was named Dwarf Friend before or after the Blackfire Pass event, because sometimes it's after, sometimes it's just saving his life. So that's also worth noting. What matters is this is an event that definitely occurred because it's in the records. Unless you subscribe to records could have been falsified, but these are dwarves. The only easy way to do that would be with magic, and we all know how well that goes down with dwarves.
Yeah, and it's so fascinating to think of that and you can see it reflected all these thousands of years later, that for the High King, and therefore for many of the dwarves that he would pass on these opinions to later, that he was able to look at this and go, humans can be better. They could be so much better than what we thought they could, which causes just such a paradigm shift. Which, hey, getting a dwarf to change his mind on something is pretty impressive, especially a High King. They are notoriously stubborn.
Yeah, and I'm going to say that there's an unwritten part to this story as well. Because typically the story at this point then leads on to Sigmar going out and effectively binding the other tribes together underneath his rule. And there's a variety of reasons for doing this. The most common reason is the great greenskin horde threat lies out there as the external enemy. We have to bind together to destroy it, or we ourselves will all be individually destroyed. Together, we are stronger. A core Sigmarite doctrine. Community work together. Apart, we will crumble. And that's generally put forward as the core motivation for Sigmar in most of the tales. But when you actually look at it with a dispassionate external view, it's quite clear that he and Kurgan talk and did talk. They must have.
Oh, yeah.
Because the entirety of what becomes the Empire becomes a model of the Dwarf Empire. The Dwarf Karaz is remodeled into the Empire with the humans. Clearly, Sigmar and this High King are talking a lot, leading up to and after. So I would suggest his desire to bind the kings, as he views it, under a High King, or the desire to bind the tribes underneath a single chief, a single king of kings, very much comes from the dwarfs.
Yeah, one of the things that's really interesting that doesn't get focused as much if you're looking at it from a pure Empire perspective is that undeniably from the dwarf perspective, the title of like dwarf friend was not just, oh, Sigmar did something really cool, so he gets this honorific and then like whatever. They were very, very close. Like High King Kurgan and Sigmar were genuinely very close friends. To kind of like a shocking extent, like almost to like a High King Story, Whitebeard, and Malekith level extent.
Yeah. Of that, there's no doubt. Absolutely none. And particularly when you get to the end of Sigmar's reign and the end of his life, some 50 years after he's eventually crowned the King of Kings, so to speak. And he decides to go back to the High King first. That's his job. He's going down to see him. That's what he does when he abdicates. He's off to the High King and he intends to return Ghal Maraz. Because as far as he's concerned, it's not his hammer. It's the High King's hammer. So he was going to be returning it. But that's in the future. But I think there is absolutely no doubt that for all the stories don't necessarily focus on this particular relationship because they're often far more interested in either the mythical events of the things that Sigmar did or alternatively the binding together of all the tribes and his first crowning. That tends to be what most of them focus on, the human interactions mostly, and the big battles. It is clear that the High King and he not only talked a lot, they really got on, and the High King was not just impressed with the young lad, he was thoroughly impressed. He wasn't just, this guy saved my life, thanks, I'm thankful. That was the original story. The original story Graham wrote was quite simple. I'm thankful. Here's a hammer. Let's move on. But dwarves changed after that and became a far different species with their culture and everything else. The Empire changed also. It is clear that the High King absolutely got on with him at a fundamental level, almost in some respects see him like a son. are seeing him as someone that he can help. He saw pure heart. He saw something that it was worth not just naming Devonger, not just saving, not just a brilliance in a man. He saw something. Yeah, I could argue the spark of the divine if you wish. But it's fair to say that not only do we have the entire empire following the model this king is almost certainly going to provide, but the empire turns to ancestor worship, exactly like the dwarves, right after this.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Because they reflect the great deeds of the old dwarven kings, and Sigmar was doing this. Sigmarism, as far as dwarves are concerned, is absolutely a logical next step.
Yeah. So after this, Sigmar goes home. That same year, he has another big battle in his life, which is the Battle of Asselborn Bridge. Not Asselborn Bridge. Battle of Astafen Bridge. And this battle is big for Sigmar because it's his first big. He's going to lose somebody he cares about a lot. Which
I'll also note that this battle is often placed before meeting Kurgan as well. Just noting.
Oh yeah. Take everything we have with it's very wibbly wobbly about where exactly it
totally. When these things happen.
Yeah. So it's another big battle against Greenskins, but the big important thing that happens in this battle is that Sigmar's life, his early life, revolved around three really, really close friends, which were Trinovantes, Pendrag, and Wolfram, I think is his name. And Trinovantes dies in this battle. Now, granted, versions of the story will differ. The more gleaming versions of Sigmar's life have him volunteering to basically hold off the Greenskins at a very narrow crossing to buy time for Sigmar's forces to regroup and then defeat the Greenskins. But regardless of how it goes down, he dies in this fight. And the really important thing about Trinovantes, beyond just being very close to Sigmar and his death hurts Sigmar very dearly, is that Trinovantes had a twin. And his twin was a man named Garen, or Garion, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And if you know, you know, but we will talk about him later.
If you know, you know.
Yeah, he will come back up later. But needless to say, when Sigmar comes home, bearing Trinovantes on a shield, the big thing is that Garen, who has now lost his twin brother, and he was not able to go to the fight for, I think his one of his his hand was broke. Something had happened to him, and he was injured, so he couldn't go to the fight. So his twin brother is dead, and he does not take it well. Mm-hmm. And the other aspect is that Sigmar is head over heels, way super duper in love with Trinovantes and Garen's sister, who I believe is their older sister, if I remember right. And so Garen really hates Sigmar at this point because he blames him utterly for the death of his twin. Even though Trinovantes was the one that, in pretty much all versions of the story, made the choice to hold the line. It was a heroic sacrifice, but that's not how Garion sees it. He sees it as Sigmar offered his brother up to slaughter. And they struggle with a relationship. But I am going to let that other Garion sit in the myth of what happens next for a little bit. So
shall we jump into some chats?
Oh, yeah. Let's get
so we don't go, because we're going to get caught up in the story of Sigmar easily. And again, if you've got any questions about Sigmar, as we said, do make sure you ask.
Yeah. Hammond, dwarves when they interact with Umgi. Gods, I hate Umgi. My father hated them too, even before they messed with his blueprints. There's you joke, but there probably is a big thing about the first interaction between dwarves and Umgi was probably not great. And that probably instantly soured relations for hundreds of years.
Yeah, I even wrote a little bit about the dwarves when they first encountered the humans making their way across Blackfire Pass. So some 800 years before the time of Sigmar, and it didn't go down well at all. That's when they named them Umgi, Umgak, all the rest of it, and that was I find it's a fascinating time in general because we have conflicting stories for how humanity works with the overall story of Warhammer. Because if we go with the stories that are presented right at the very beginning of Warhammer and the Enemy Within, humanity arriving in the basin there are like basic tribesmen. They are really simple. And they often forget that just down south, just a few hundred miles away, we've got ourselves a massive advanced civilization.
Yeah, one of the things that's super fascinating, one of the things that's never really been explored with them, and it's such a damn shame, is that there should have been really notable interactions between ancient Hekara and the dwarfs.
Yep.
Absolutely. Like Cetra the Imperishable would have been someone the dwarves would have dealt with when he moved his empire all the way up to the Black Mountains. Like, they would have had to deal with him. And he probably would have been an interesting individual to deal with. Though not necessarily like...
And to make it even more annoying, the works of Nehekara were not shoddy.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that there's a whole bunch of big question marks that would it'd be nice to see someone tackle that one day, of like the dwarfs, what order did they meet, like the Balthani versus the tribes that came across the mountains versus the Nehekarans, and what were those early interactions like? Because you imagine that like Kata Kadrin is going to have a very different first encounter with humanity compared to Kata Kazul, who's right down there. Like, they would have had wildly different relationships.
And I think that the best answer to that is that the dwarf language is pretty much going from the beginning. So we're going to presume that their first encounter with humanity was poor, but it significantly predates their encounter with the early tribes of Sigmar. And this could be an easy diversion, which we should not dwell on too much. But simply put, the tribes of humanity that come into the basin are saddled with very old prejudices.
Yep.
And Sigmar beats them back.
If Sigmar's empire became a republic after his passing, would he be called Sigmarks and his religion Sigmarxism?
Oh, dear.
Oh, dear indeed. Somehow I doubt it. Ricky Chapman, we could see Sigmar strangling a goblin as a kid. If a little girl could do it in Wild Kingdom, why not a future god? I have zero doubt Sigmar could have strangled.
I'm always amused, just as a small side one for Sigmar. One of the more famous images of Sigmar that was depicted is him sitting in his throne wearing his crown, slouching, and at his feet, chained up, there's a goblin jester. And I think that speaks to a far more complicated version of the Empire than the books necessarily state, where things like greenskins are not necessarily killed on sight, but they're just a part of the living world, and sometimes they are effectively, in this case, enslaved. So there is complication there that I quite liked with that image. Plus, it's a pretty dang cool image.
Yep. I 100% agree. Mornington Crescent. When Sigmar saved the High King, was he even old enough to have started shaving? No. So
probably not.
This is not relevant to anything else with Sigmar, but it's a thing I find really funny, is that so Vermintide brings this up as a conversation between Barden and I think Saltspire, and it's awesome because Vermintide has so much lore stuff if you just sit and listen to the characters talk. There's a hilarious conversation where something gets brought up to the effect of talk about Sigmar's beard, and Barden, from a dwarf perspective, says something along the lines of that he finds it very funny that the humans tend to depict Sigmar with a beard, because according to the dwarves, he didn't have one, or his beard was just not good.
So I have a contrary opinion to that, because I actually brought this up with them. Because I got sent by Fat Shark all of the dialogue in their games. All of it. Because I was working through building Ubersreich at the time, and they'd proliferated their chat with lots of little Ubersreich details that they'd added on top of the existing lore that already existed for the town. And I wanted to try and make sure that we referenced as much of it as possible, even in a little way. And when I read that bit, I was like, bullshit. The dude is the walking example of respect to dwarves. He would almost certainly have done everything he could to not just show respect, but in many respects to emulate them. He would have had a big beard. I'm calling bullshit on that line, to which he's like, yeah, but it was funny. And I was like, no, that's fair. Because it is funny. But nevertheless, I call bullshit. I am quite certain that Sigmar definitely, as he moved into his imperial years, had a significant beard.
Yeah, what the thing that I think would jumps out at me is what would be really funny is that if the dwarves have it that from a dwarven perspective, he had one, but he's a human, so it wasn't
it's
that
just, yeah,
impressive.
quite. It wouldn't be.
He couldn't
Yeah.
wrap it around his body, so he had one, but was it really one?
Yeah, quite. As Lorebeards go, he was a poor example.
Yeah, and the humans are like, no, he had a beard, and the dwarves are like, I'm not saying that. Yeah,
I mean, did it go to his knees?
Yeah. What's interesting to think though is that there's even within the art, there's a lot of different depictions of Sigmar, and whether or not he has a beard is wildly different between artists. Like Andy was talking about that really famous, super famous art of him sitting on a throne. He's clean shaven. He doesn't have a beard in that image.
Yep.
Whereas obviously Games Workshop settled on an Age of Sigmar, he has a big beard,
big luxurious beard.
God beard, yeah. Big, so it's interesting to see the different pieces of art that depict him in different ways. Where like there's the one of him at Blackfire Pass where he's like wielding the hammer and he's clean shaven. Versus
so I think if you're looking at the culture in which he was born into and the realistic nature of what beards mean, I think it is extraordinarily unlikely he wouldn't have a beard. What's the point of shaving? What benefit does it bring?
Oh, yeah.
There's literally none.
Actually,
the cosmetic benefit is negligible to the point of it will actually upset his ongoing relations with dwarves. Yeah. I can't see him being anyone other than an entirely bearded individual for all of his life.
Something that occurs to me that's actually really funny, I am 99% sure that the original covers for all three of Graham McNeil's Sigmar books have him as clean shaven.
Yeah, they are. They're all
but when the omnibus came out, the Legend of Sigmar omnibus, he has the beard now.
Does he?
Yeah, because he's got the beard.
I don't have
he's
that
standing up with the hammer up, which is super funny that they changed that. They changed.
I'm gonna go look that one up. That's brilliant. That's a great detail. Oh, there he is.
That's actually, honestly, I think the Legend of Sigmar is probably the most realistic depiction of him.
Oh, of course, I know that one. That's the one that people were saying looked like me.
yeah,
sure.
It does, actually.
I really look like that. Yeah, 100%. I think that he almost certainly would have had a beard, but that doesn't really matter because depictions will across the Empire change according to what they're doing. For example, when you've got people who worship Sigmar who are trying to distance themselves from Ulricans who don't cut their hair, they'll almost certainly say, yeah, Sigmar had no beard. He didn't need one. He was better than Ulric. He didn't follow Ulricanism, because there'll be people who have a political reason to ensure that's the case. So you'll find that the legends of Sigmar, where he is used as an actual figure that they depict, will often have him with absolutely no beard because it makes sense politically. But the reality of the actual man, he almost certainly would have had a beard.
Oh yeah, 100% agree. Yep. Phil, the story about Black Tusk reminded me. We know some of the followers of the other gods, Tall and Ulrich especially, fight the encroachment of the cult of Sigmar and sometimes outright deny his divinity. But do they respect him for his great historical accomplishments and legends? I assume there must be some laws against blasphemy or lèse-majesté. How then do some of those, I tried, some of those adversaries get around criticizing him?
The answer to that is yes, and it's complicated. The cult of Tal, for example, has long had issues with Sigmarism as largely putting Sigmar as god over all others. But that's largely political because of Empress Ottila and her secession from the Empire. And when they eventually banned Sigmar as a cult across the entirety of their separate empire. So you'll find that politics are far more likely to be the influencer here rather than necessarily the reality of the truth on the ground, so to speak. But yes, there's going to be lots of people who claim one thing or another, but it's been 200 years since that was a core component of any major philosophy in the empire. So come the end times, it's very much grounded across the empire that he is a god, and the heresy that he's not is that a heresy as far as most of the cults are concerned. To say that he's not a god is quite obviously nonsensical and doesn't make a great deal of sense in practice. So broadly speaking, sure, there's going to be lots who don't, but...
Yeah, in universe, you tend to see a lot more arguing about what exactly is his position as a god and like where he is among the others, which makes it interesting. Listener Chris, would be interesting to read a story of the White Dwarf running into Sigmar. I would be willing to bet a stupid amount of money that Grombrindal bumped into Sigmar at some point.
Yeah, given the nature of Sigmar, given the nature of his relationships with the dwarfs, and given the extraordinary deeds that he did in life, some of which are irrefutable, there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that they crossed paths.
Yeah,
because
there's actually
you can't face Nagash and Drachenfels and Chaos Lords and everything greenskin that ever walked.
Everybody that was anybody.
Yeah, pretty much. It's Sigmar in his lifetime has an absolutely daft number of encounters. That the more you look at it, the more you go, I'm not sure I can fit this into a realistic timeline, because it doesn't all add up. He'd be literally doing an I was about to bring up a Skaven there that I won't mention. He would be doing far too much in far too little time.
I actually have a great example of that. Sigmar's story is so bloated, to put it bluntly, with like legendary characters and encounters, that the Legend of Sigmar is a big fucking book. Like it's a good hefty omnibus that got a bonus short story about Sigmar's big final showdown with Krell. So it's got all this stuff, and yet Graham McNeil did not get to write anything about Sigmar fighting Morcar, the first ever chosen, which you would think would be like a pretty important book to have written.
But as we've noted, Morcar probably isn't the first ever chosen.
Yeah, true. But like fighting an ever chosen, you think would have a dedicated novel. It doesn't.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? It's crazy. Jake Woo's saying that it was in one of the short stories in the omnibus. I don't have the omnibus. I don't know if that's the case, Jake Woo. So he was saying
I know there's a Sigmar fights Morcar in the Archaon series, which is a weird place for it to show up, but it does show up there.
So there is something that's just worth, as a small aside there, mentioning about Morcar, and we need to have a proper Ever Chosen stream at some point.
We will.
But Morcar was moved from the very first Phoenix King, Anarion being his great fight, because the general belief at the time was there was no humans who could be responsible for being Morcar. They just weren't there. Humanity hadn't reached that point in its advancement. They were not that point.
God forbid
that has
been anything but human.
and the first incursion of Chaos was 100% demons, all of it. And that was the story that they were running with at the time. However, that story has changed completely. If we go to the old world, humanity is there from the beginning. They are one of the elder species, contrary to how the elder species may term them. And humanity not only could be there during the Great Fall, they were there during the Great Fall, which means that we can easily have Morcar right at the very beginning if we wish to do so, without contradicting any of the other lore parts. But that was a 6th edition change. I think it was 6th.
Yeah. Jiku, sorry, you were talking about Grombrindal and Sigmar. Maybe.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about. Grombrindal and Sigmar.
Maybe, I'm not sure. Especially because it gets complicated in my head, because in the White Dwarf magazines, they would do this kind of cutesy thing where you could do Grombrindal asks, where writers or people could write in to ask Grombrindal questions, and he would give answers that, whether or not they're technically canonical, is really confusing, because like he's giving you actual in-universe answers from his perspective, but he's also writing from an out-of-universe perspective, which makes it like 5D chess. And I'm pretty sure there's one where someone wrote in about Sigmar and Grombrindal, like talks about him, but it's a whole brain fuck thing. Marathi, in real life, ancient figures aren't always shown in the dress of their day, like medieval art of Achilles as a knight. So would have Sigmar not as a barbarian, as far as like how he's portraying dress and such?
Marathi, I completely agree. I don't just agree with this. I strongly agree with this. The depictions of Sigmar would almost always reflect the real world. I say real world. It would the trends of the day. They were probably wearing the fashions of the day. And we repeated this over in which book was that? That was Empire at War, when we were discussing the Kislev and was it Kislev? No, it wasn't. It was Talabikland. No, it was Kislev. And we're saying that the Kislevite monarchs would often be depicted at various points wearing the clothes of the day, even when obviously they would be wearing things very differently in the past.
We talked about this with Myrmidia as well in a prior stream.
Yeah, absolutely.
She's in different guys.
Indeed. Although she's a Ghal.
Ah.
I'm sorry. I'm ill. I can do bad jokes. But yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. And I think that would definitely be a thing. Sigmar would be depicted according to the needs of the day, which means if you had an ancient fresco that was maybe made 1,000 years ago, he would probably be wearing clothes that are somewhat similar to the clothes of the day, because they always want to make Sigmar look special, as if he's somehow elevated to those who are around him. He is, after all, a living man god, and they want to very much show that he was forward thinking. I mean, after all, he was literally forward thinking in that he created the empire during his 50-year reign in such an extraordinary fashion that it was to last for, well, arguably 2,500 years ago, although you could also argue it broke down after 1,000
it took a break there for a bit.
Yeah, exactly.
Phil, has Sigmar ever encountered elves at some point of his life? What do you think they would have thought of him as right? So I will say, has he encountered elves? Yes. 100% yes. Is that covered in his stories? No. Not really. To me, it seems genuinely impossible that he would not have run into the elves of the Lorelorn at minimum. And he almost assuredly, based on how they act, well, depending on which edition you look at, how they act in later editions, he likely would have ran into other Azrai of the like other wood elf type elves of the old world, and probably would have bumped into some high elves. But definitely wood elves.
Right,
the Lorelorn is like impossible. There's no way he would not have run into them.
Hard agree. So we have the official story, which does not involve elves. And I think that is almost certainly a very real in-world choice, because the cult of Sigmar strongly allies with the dwarves, and they will not want to be associated with those dastardly Elgi. Keep them as a separate part. It makes sense in world, but in terms of the actual history, Sigmar in later parts, which we are as far away from as we can possibly be in terms of this.
We're not in the Black Art Path yet.
I'm not. God knows how we're going to do this in less than 2 streams. But in his later years, he is responsible for campaigning outwards and securing what is in some books referred to as the Reich Basin, and other books just simply referred to as the modern day empire. But basically the borders that we recognize as the empire plus the wasteland and large chunks of Kislev are taken by Sigmar and his forces. And he is at the forefront of a good chunk of this. And that would involve deep issues when they moved into the Lorelorn, because the Lorelorn is held by elves and has been for a long time. Plus, the Teutigans are known to have had relations with the Lorelorn since Sigmar's time, which means that there's already diplomacy going on there, and Sigmar later will take over as king that tribe. He'll pass it on to another, but he will take that tribe. He is the core diplomatic representative for the Teutigan tribe later on, which means he must have been not just aware of them, but met with them. Particularly when he took over, they'll be concerned about certain things. The Lorelorn elves are political. They will certainly have been involved with them. So the answer is definitely yes. The Lorelorn elves in no way would have allowed that sort of figure to be on their border without approaching, understanding, and hopefully controlling. They completely will have looked to try and channel the excesses of Sigmar and his potential fury, because hell, he is a dangerous figure. They will have been involved with him. So the answer is yes, but I think politically speaking that and most of those relationships will have been excised from a lot of records, purely because the Sigmarite cult will not want to be associated with elves, because they are the great evil that led to the downfall of the dwarves that Sigmar saved them from. Sigmar is responsible for ending the Goblin Wars that were pretty much set up at the end when the elves betrayed everyone and were the worst. So it's not politically astute for the Sigmar cult to associate themselves with elves. They are on the outside, and I think it makes sense historically.
Yeah, and as far as what they would have thought of them, it's hard to imagine. Well, I don't know if it's that hard. It would have been interesting, but I think the big thing that the elves probably would have seen in Sigmar is a stabilizer, someone that kind of stabilizes all the human tribes and is getting rid of things that the elves just don't like like greenskins and beastmen.
Yeah, he put down the Teutigans. He put the Teutigans into their place and pacified them. The Teutigans are the most warlike, except for maybe the Tulutans, which are the modern day Talabic landers, who are proper mental. So the Teutigans are bad, and he puts them down and takes over them. And that is significant because that is a primary source of potential antagonism for the Lorelorn elves. And he very much will have been approached. He very much will be a part of their political framework. So no doubt.
Yep. So, we got one last little thing here. Sigmar going east and Grimgor and Monkey King going west. Yeah, truly a meeting of the minds that would have been. God only knows. Well, I mean, if Grimgor and Sigmar saw each other, it would have been on site for those two. But the Big E would have been, or the Monkey King would have been an interesting thing. And hell, I wouldn't even be shocked if when the Monkey King comes out, they're like, oh yeah, he was doing trickster shit in the distant west and bumped into Sigmar. That would not shock me in the slightest. Because Sigmar meets everybody. Where we left off before we were doing Super Chat stuff was, okay, so Trinovantes dies and the whole thing with Garen goes down. So the big thing that Sigmar does after this, depending on, once again, this could have happened before or after, depending on which version of the story you're looking at, is Sigmar's father dies. And Sigmar's father in most versions of the story that I'm aware of is killed by the Norsey, where he goes up and he gets in a big fight with them. And the Norsey being a tribe that has a very the Norsey are interesting because the way I would posit it is no matter what version of the story you're reading, the way the Norsey are going to be portrayed is deliberately false. Of that, like when you read like the, I think it's the Legend of Sigmar version by Graham McNeil, the guy that kills, the king of the Norsey that kills Sigmar's father is literally a cornate champion of chaos in chaos armor. Like he is a big chaos boy. And Sigmar's father is able to kill him, but then dies pretty much immediately afterwards. And there's a big part of me that says doubt. Like I do not think that the Norsey at that time would have had a literal chaos warrior stomping around as the head of their tribe because they hadn't been kicked up to Norska yet. Now they might have. It's possible they might have. I think the story would have been a lot more complex than that.
Yeah, so the complex version is the one that was written into Tome of Salvation, for example. And this was with some discussion because we had a situation where the Norsey were going to be kicked out of the Empire by Sigmar. Because that's what happens. Sigmar basically goes to war with the Norsey. And different versions of the story at that point didn't really exist as to why. And the story was clear that Sigmar was not in any way accepted by the Norsey because he asked them to go to war and they said no. And the Great War in the South, with Blackfire Pass to come against the Greenskins, the Norsey said no. And in the version that was presented there, it's because the Norsey were effectively farmers. They were not the great warriors, the great chaos warriors, the great whatever that they were to become later. They were a peaceful tribe in the north, much like the Belthani were a peaceful tribe in the center of the empire. And the Norsey basically turn Sigmar down, and he does not take it at all well. Later stories completely take it in a different direction. I mean later chronologically in terms of when they were written by various writers. And later on, Graham McNeil, for example, turns them into Chaos Warriors, even though they've yet to be sent forward into Norska. Norska isn't called Norska because that's what it's called. It's called it because that's where the Norse were thrown into by Sigmar when he went to war with them. And he does go to war with them. Now, clearly, there's a bigger story here. And the story that Graham went with was the Norse were responsible for killing his father. I'm pretty sure he's the first person who said that. And in previous versions, it wasn't that. His father died in different circumstances entirely. And I think that's a good justification. I think there's definitely something to that. However, them being gigantic Chaos Warriors, I somewhat side with Sotek here. It seems deeply unlikely.
For me, the idea that you have a tribe that has a more peaceful, defensive-minded leaning, and the Umburagans attack, because that's what Umburagans do.
Yeah.
And the king of the Umburagans is killed in the fighting, and Sigmar loses his shit. Because, to be fair, in every version of the story, he loses his shit with the Norsey. whatever the inciting incident is differs. But Sigmar, this is his first. Sigmar genocides like a motherfucker.
Yep.
He tries his damnedest to exterminate the Norsi. They successfully flee north and have a really bad time with the Ungulls before fleeing further north and arriving in Norska, where it's the only place they can survive. And it is a harsh, unforgiving hellscape compared to their prior lands, which tells for a fascinating story. But regardless, every version of the story focuses this at this point. Sigmar, it's noted almost rather casually because it's a massacre. It's not like the Unburgans like really struggle, and it's not the United Empire. It's just the Unburgan go in there and they slaughter the Norsi and chase them out.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also worth noting that this part of the story is also dislocated in several places. Sometimes it happens when Sigmar is young. I think that's what Graham McNeil went with, as I recall.
Yeah. It was quite young.
And the previous one before that, it happened when Sigmar was a good 20 years into his reign. That's when the true genocide started beginning.
There's another genocide in Graham McNeil's version.
Yay! That's because the both Belfani, which they also pretty much genocide, and the Norsi, the two tribes that were indigenous. The Belfani had already been wiped out largely by all of the wars leading up to then, but the Norsi in the north had held off. They were probably a northern tribe who may have been Chaos aligned to begin with, so it completely makes sense where you could get Chaos Warriors if you wanted to do so, if you want to go with that version. And they had settled there, but they weren't expansionist. They were as peaceful as you can get given the nature of what they were, in that they weren't moving outwards. They were on the receiving end of Tudigan attacks, they were on the receiving end of Tolutin attacks, from the Dosi attacks, and they had held their own. They were encamped and they were strong, and Sigmar kicks their ass. In whichever version you go with, Sigmar goes to town on them, and whether it's because it was his father's death, whether it's because there was chaos, whether it's because something else, in many respects almost all of them look like justifications after the fact. He was a warrior king, and he went to war and he claimed his land.
Yep. And after this, we get the Great Gathering of the Tribes, which plays off, if you're familiar with Hercules and the 12 Labors, it feels a lot like that, where basically Sigmar runs around to each of the different tribes to unite them against the oncoming, because they get word basically from the dwarfs of like, something's coming, like the Greenskins are coming, and this is not a typical WoW. This is a WoW that will wipe out everything that is not orc. Like this is the end of days if we do not stop this. So Sigmar goes around trying to unify everybody, and like Annie said, not everyone says yes. I mean, the Brittany tribe very famously goes, nope, deuces. And Sigmar smacks them around a bit, and they run across. Well, whether or not they fight is actually a bit debatable, but they end up fleeing across the mountain. Yeah.
There's a fight there. There's some really fascinating bits throughout this entire section. Because this is somewhere where we could probably spend like a stream discussing.
Yeah, an entire stream. And we might
easily. And we might do that. Given where we are at the moment, we might end up doing that, because this section is a fascinating section, because the section where Sigmar goes from being a clan chief, a king of a single tribe, to being the king of multiple tribes, or the ally of multiple tribes. And he binds together a great confederation of humanity to effectively hold off the Greenskin attack that is coming from the south, which is pretty amazing in and of itself. And some of the things that are done move to almost mythic level. We have a vacillation between political and diplomatic routes to war, and doing some crazy stuff like passing through holy flames or taking down dragon ogres the size of mountains. We have a lovely mixture of different things that Sigmar does as he goes from tribe to tribe to tribe, and they're not all successful. For example, the Ungulls, he famously does not get them to agree to either ally or alternatively to follow his rule. But the Ungals do come to Blackfire Pass and supply forces, meaning that there's a story there that's not fully explained because they are there. The Bretonni are also there at Blackfire Pass in some fashion. So clearly something's gone down, or maybe there's factionalism amongst those individual tribes which was not fully formed, but the tribe as a whole did not follow. And these other tribes, when we then come to post Blackfire Pass, are wailed upon. It's not just the Norsi that have it bad. All of the tribes that do not follow Sigmar's rule get their asses handed to them. He goes to town on them during the course of his rule, and this is a time that Sigmarites will forever hark back to, right down to how they build their cult into individual, what's called lectorics, individual areas. They're all based off the area that Sigmar claimed during his rule. And he claims pretty much all the Empire, all the way over to what's now the modern-day wasteland, huge chunks of what sets into Kislev, and that is all that he conquers, because after he effectively binds them all together, he will later conquer, which is an easy thing to forget, that Sigmar was not just a great unifier, he was a conqueror, which goes very well with the more modern interpretation of what the cult became as we moved through the late 90s into the noughties and the teens, I suppose, where he moves from being just the patron of the Empire to an actual warrior god. And that's how he's depicted in all of the army lists. The army lists very much say, warrior god, he kicks ass and chews gum. And that very much is how he is presented in his later rule. But the Great 12 Tasks for the 12 Tribes is, I think, a stream to come, because it's a really fun part.
I think we're going to kind of hop over it and let that be its own stream.
Because
but the important
it's enormously important. He binds them together.
Yeah. So he does that. And like Andy said, he does actually score a couple of allies from some of the other tribes, but ultimately afterwards they're going to get kicked out. So if you're Bretonny, Ungol, or Norsi, Sigmar was not somebody you liked.
Or Mendel or Freaking or whoever else.
Yeah. And EJ, this is a really, really good thing to think about, I think, of what would you rather face for the Norsi, and they chose Norska over Sigmar. We would rather deal with that is a telling thing.
It's a really good comment, and agreed completely. Sigmar was a horror. I mean, he's great.
He's great as long as you do what he tells you to.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So, this builds up to the big series of battles against the Greenskins, which isn't just Blackfire Pass. It actually took a while for them to fight down to Blackfire Pass, because that was like the core of the Horde, but there were a lot of elements that had come already through. There was like a really, really big battle at the River Aver. There was a big battle at the River Stir, I think. And Sigmar and the United Tribes were pushing the Greenskins back towards Blackfire Pass while also sending word to the dwarfs of, we're going to try and hold them here. It's a big, narrow, super badass looking volcanic valley that was supposedly burned or melted through the mountains by an ancient dragon fighting fucking Grimnir, which is just a kick-ass story. But this is where we'll hold them because their numbers won't matter. Because the thing is that's so great about this story is that it's very bluntly stated that if they had not fought at Blackfire Pass, there was zero chance of victory. Like, there were so many fucking Greenskins, they would have just drowned in a tide of orcs and goblins.
Yeah, agreed. This is the war to end all wars. As they perceive it at the time. It's an existential war. Sigmar is moving with the authority of desperation. They are going to get wiped out. And it's clear that the dwarves have strongly influenced him as to how he can best survive this. And the dwarf influence is bind everyone together, become the king of kings like I am. I'm the king of kings. And if we work together, we can bring this to an end. And we can do this. Greenskins can be controlled, can be channeled, can be herded, for want of a better description. We can win this war. And Sigmar does his great 12 trials, which I'm now really liking, just as a model, because it's pretty much accurate. Binds together the great 12 tribes that will become the nascent empire to be, and marches with them all. And they have a host of stories as to who marches when, who dies, who doesn't die. And they all, as this great big company, head south with whatever allies are willing to come along with them. And this is an event of extraordinary importance because it consolidates the empire as the old world power, because they save the dwarves. And this cannot be underestimated enough for the impact and significance that it has upon the old world as a whole. The dwarves were going to lose. They just were. They had been fighting a losing battle for centuries, and they were on the brink of losing completely. And if it wasn't for bringing in effectively a replacement for their old elven allies who had betrayed them, they were dead. And King Kurgan, if you want to be really ruthless, fashioned humanity into a weapon. High King Kurgan saw potential.
I just want to say, as a little criticism towards some folks out there that always like to throw jabs at Bretonnia. A lot of people are like, oh, Bretonnia got tricked. They're used by the elves. The Empire had the exact fucking same thing done to them. It was just done by the dwarves.
Yeah. And Sigmar becomes basically, I mean, it sounds like I'm being daft here when I say it, but he effectively becomes a dwarf tool. And like any dwarven tool, it's really looked after. And it's very carefully shaped. And they turn the humanity mess of the Reich Basin into a set of kings with a high king over them that they call Elector Counts and an Emperor. He models them and puts them all together. They're bound, and Sigmar is the one who is capable of doing it all. And they give him the magical hammer that allows him to effectively come to their aid and end the war. And this is obviously a very weighted way of looking at it, because I don't think that literally High King Kurgan was sitting there going, yep, we can turn them into a weapon that will win us the war.
No, that's too elven. He's a dwarf.
That's way too elven. It's far more a host of events that occurred one after the other, and a meeting of minds and an awareness that, holy shit, we might be able to get out of this. We might be able to get out of this. And the dwarves are forever indebted to the Empire because of this, meaning that the trade routes that come afterwards are because of the dwarves. The dwarves, immediately after the war comes to an end, start building roads connecting all of the core cities of the core tribes. They forge weapon after weapon of runic weapons for their Elector Counts to ensure that that empire stands strong and can fight off against other potential incursions. To cut a long story short, the dwarves fully support this nascent empire of Sigmar. And Sigmar is not just appreciative, he is, in many respects, completely in love with his dwarven allies. And come the end of his reign, as we mentioned already, will return to them. Or at least that's his plan.
Yeah. So, as you may guess, the quote-unquote good guys, when the Battle of Blackfire Pass, it is a titanic battle. It's covered quite in depth in a number of books. If you ever want to check those out, like obviously Graham McNeil has several chapters dedicated to it in the first book. Yeah. And and it's ridiculous. It's beyond epic. It's got all the tribes doing all sorts of cool things. There's some really funny notes about it that appear in several books about Imperial historians kick it up to a very mythic status where they like to say that a lot of techniques were invented during this battle, which always makes me laugh. The idea that like you're at this big apocalyptic battle and someone would go, let's try something new we've never done before. This is a great time. Which is very silly to think. But, this is one of those battles that is just the Warhammer world will never forget because it was that legendary.
Yeah, Battle of Blackfire Pass. It's one of the very first battles ever written about in Warhammer as a Warhammer battle, when it was written all the way back in The Enemy Within, and the battle for Blackfire Pass that consolidates the foundation point of the Empire. This also consolidates not just the Empire, not just the allegiance with the dwarfs, but it consolidates Sigmar's life as one of extraordinary and epic proportion. It's no surprise that he is attributed with all manner of epic events. Now, it's the Warhammer world. He may have done all of them, and that would not be out of character for the Warhammer world. And many writers who are writing it almost certainly think he has done all of them. But equally, it's the Warhammer world. He might have done none of them, because the Warhammer world is known for its shades of grey and its lack of certainty. There are certain things that are without doubt that he did, because the dwarves being the dwarves, when they've recorded certain things, they happened. The battle happened. Becoming Dwarfriend happened. The foundation of the Empire happened. Nagash definitely happened. But once we get beyond that, it all gets very hazy and very, because some of it's just convenient. Some of it's way over the top in comparison to his other feats that supposedly happen at the same time, and he's less capable of performing. He is a character who has been written by multiple authors, and thus we have multiple versions of what Sigmar can be, whether it is just a man who is exceedingly effective but broken, who has a proper temper, who does things he probably shouldn't sometimes, who makes mistakes, but is brilliant as well. Or alternatively, he's almost a walking god right from the outset. It's also worth noting one other thing that we brought up in our previous streams that I do think is worth, given that we're almost at time, bringing up, particularly because we're not just talking about Sigmar the man, we're talking about Sigmar the god. There are multiple versions of when he eventually ascends, but there is one story that is almost universally applied, and that's that Sigmar at some point passes through the flame of Ulrich. And if you don't know, there's a great eternal flame of argent white, icy cold fire burning at the top of a mountain near the edge of the middle mountains that will one day become the great capital of Middenheim in the north. And this great burning fire is put there by Ulrich. Doesn't matter which story you go with, there's lots of them. It's there by Ulrich, and he passes through it, showing that he should be not just the leader of the Tudegans, but is effectively like a god. And there are certainly some who believe this is when he actually ascends, and that he then comes out the other side effectively like like an Aryan, yeah, like a living embodiment of Ulrich, possessed by Ulrich, the god of war. And that he effectively becomes almost a human version of the elven avatars. And there is definitely an argument that could be had there. And it's an argument, and I think that's all it is. It's an argument. The official story is that he will ascend much, much later. The unofficial story is that he passes through a god flame in the same way that Anarion did several millennia earlier. And from that point forwards, it becomes effectively unstoppable. And it's fascinating that if you look at the actual timeline, it's after he does that he does all of his more crazy stuff, like taking on mountain-sized dragon ogres or gigantic creatures from hell, or indeed taking on an entire orc horde. So there is an entire story there that could definitely be told if there was a writer that was interested in doing so.
Yep. And the last thing I'll note before we get into the last super chats and kind of wrap up here is that
one of the time we've done nothing.
I know. One of the things that actually kind of supports what Andy just said, but even if you don't want that theory, one of the things that's fascinating about the third battle or the first battle Blackfire Pass from the greenskin perspective is that Sigmar beats them so bad, beats them up so bad that it is burned into their racial memory. Because the greenskins have this really interesting thing that not all writers touch on it. It's definitely something that some writers really like and some kind of don't. That leans very heavily into that almost like they have almost like a fungal network type thing, where greenskins, a lot of them are described as kind of almost having like a fundamental memory that connects all of them. And there are certain things that when they encounter them, they almost have you know how like humans, if you see a spider, you go, ugh. Even though you haven't had much personal experience, it's kind of in our genetic memory.
And the goblin fear of elves.
Yeah, the goblin fear of elves, yeah. So for greenskins, orcs in particular, but all greenskins have that fear of Sigmar. Now, it doesn't always express, and there is a really, really famous moment where it expresses in the third Battle of Blackfire Pass, and it's one of my favorite scenes with Karl Franz. But it's a fascinating thing of that on one hand, could support the idea that Sigmar was more than a man at this point, that he was able to inflict something like that on the orcs. Or you could just say that it was just that legendary of an achievement when he was literally slaughtering so many orcs with Ghal Maraz that he was standing on a body of greenskins just going crazy. Which if you
Yeah,
know like how orcs tend to compare against humans, that is spooky.
It's crazy. It's crazy, yeah. And I sort of love that. And if you're looking to justify, you have more than enough justification with just that simple flame and what it did and what actually happens, because then he would be effectively already a demigod. And that could inflict racial memory nonsense on greenskins, because he's no longer human per se. Now, the official story is not that. Let's be completely clear. That's not us saying this is what the story is. But we're always here at Lorebeards trying to look at the overall picture and try to make sense of the things that aren't necessarily explained. Because at this point, he's a mortal man. And if he's a mortal man, many of the things that he does is beyond the ability of most mortal men. So how has he done it? We have already an in-game rationalization for how it could occur. So the world and the setting that's offered there most certainly provides all answers if you want to use them, but they are very unofficial.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, last couple super chats. Brian Lyons, playing an Emmerich campaign while getting my daily dose of Warhammer lore. Thank you so much, lads, for everything you do for the community. I hope this podcast lasts for years to come and hopefully gets even more popular. Well, hey, we really appreciate that.
Thank you very much. Appreciated.
Jeremiah Safford, is there an alternate name besides the Empire of Man and the Empire? I have trouble imagining anyone besides Imperials and the Kairos Encore use that name.
Yeah. So the Empire Man is a name I actually despise. And when they used that in the old world, I was like, oh, holy crap, if they have to do that. The Empire has always been a bit of a problem for naming. When I was told to avoid it when I was writing for Warhammer during the 2nd edition. In the 4th edition, I again queried and said if I could pin it down to actually have its own title, and the answer was again no, just use the Empire. So the reason that we don't have a nice clean answer on this is because Games Workshop themselves have veered away from it, because I'm not entirely sure they know, or any individual there knows exactly what they would prefer it to be. So thus, each individual writer comes in and occasionally adds an extra word or two, and then they get removed from the next iteration. And then another couple are added on.
Yeah, because it is a very clanky thing. Imagining like people in Grand Cathay being like, the Empire, and it's like, which Empire?
Yeah, quite.
You know, the Empire. And it's like, well, like the Empire of Sigmar, I guess, kind of works. But that still feels... It feels like they would have a country name, and they just don't, which is weird.
It's weird. The setup is slightly weird, and it is a holdover from the earlier editions where it was just the Empire. And then as they built the world and added more to it, and they were like, oh, there's multiple empires. Oops. But they never really answered that one. So the answer is, sadly, there's multiple answers, none of which are really canonical because they change their ideas every other year.
Yeah, so have fun with that.
Yeah, totally.
But that brings us to today's time, and we had to skip over
holy crap, we did hardly anything
just to get to the
wow. Okay, so I have a conclusion that I would like to just throw out there, just as a nice wee way to end. So a nice little conclusion at the end. Clearly, Sigmar is a big topic, and it's a topic that we kind of put off because we knew it was a big topic.
Oh, yeah.
And we decided, for a birthday stream, this is a super fun one to dive into at least, but how the hell are we going to do this? And our first suggestion was, we'll just deal with his mortal bit. And then we sort of looked at each other and went, oh, crap, there's tons of that. We eventually arrived on, we'll do multiple streams. We'll figure it out as we go. As we often do, we don't plan these really well. We don't just sit down and go, today we're covering this. We tend to just go because we know most of it already. And today was, let's see where it lands. And the answer is that we've arrived at Blackfire Pass and we've had to do a big skip. So I'm going to put out the suggestion, and please dive into our Discords and tell us if you think this is a good suggestion. Put out the suggestion that when we go to Sigmar Part 2, that we describe the binding together of all the tribes and everything that happens there. Because I think that'll probably take a stream in and of itself.
Yeah, the 12 tribal trials.
Yeah, quite. That'd be quite fun. And we can take a good look at everything that occurred during that, because some of the events are pretty extraordinary, and that'll be super fun to dive into. However, if you think it'd be much more fun to dive into what he does as Emperor once he's bound everything together, our Nagashes, our Drachenfels, our Crown of Sorcery,
and our totally not Judas Demon Prince.
100%, and all of that. I mean, we have tons of tales that come afterwards as well, and we're not even glanced upon Ever-Chosen nonsense. We've got a lot we can cover there too. We've also got the potential for outside influence with vampires and all the rest of exactly what's going down at this point.
God,
so
I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, quite. So we've got a lot we could do there too. There's a lot we could cover. Now, the obvious logical next step would be, let's cover the trials. But if you think you'd rather have something else, do tell us. Either drop it into the comments if you're watching this long after we've made the stream, because we watch our comments. We might not answer to them all because there's only so much time in the day, but we absolutely do read them. Do drop them in there, or alternatively, jump into our Discords. And finally, if you haven't bought it already, buy Dark Deeds, because I like eating lunch.
My second copy.
Hey! And if you want to see Dark Deeds being played, it'll be going up on Monday, hopefully, assuming Aaron can make the edit work, because the file is it's currently saying it's like 80 gig. It's huge.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I know. It's going to take her about 2 days to upload that. But yeah, we've got a game of Dark Deeds being played inside the Warhammer world, which is super, super fun. But that's beside the point. So what would you like to see us do next with Sigmar is what I'm asking.
Yep. Last couple things is that with this, actually, we have wrapped up.
Are we done?
Birthday celebration. We
crap.
made it.
Have we?
Yeah, but this is the last one.
Was it? Oh wow.
Yeah. Which is actually
took us a while.
A little bit extra funny to me, because that means we should have done a vote last week, but I forgot. So here on Andy's channel, after this stream is over, which it will be in just a little bit, we are going to put up a poll, which y'all haven't seen for a hot minute, over what we're going to talk about next. So congrats. The power is returning to the people.
Yeah.
The coup nice. Of the Lorebeards is over.
We haven't done this for a while. I'm quite looking forward to it.
Yeah, been about 2 months. So should be fun. So keep an eye out for that. It'll be here on the Warhammer channel. So just, leave the tab open and hit refresh in like 20 minutes. Okay. I think it's time for us to go.
It certainly is. I'd just like to say one more time, thank you all so much for the support over the course of the last year. It has been enormously appreciated, whether that's dropping in comments, throwing super chats. It's always nice to have a super chat or two just because it pays for our lunch, or whatever else that you're doing, whether it's engaging over in Discord or if it's just turning up and saying hi. It is amazing. Without you, this channel wouldn't exist. You're all the best. Thank you so much.
Bye, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.